In the years just after 1000, the statesman and preacher Wulfstan was writing at a time when many continued to anticipate the end of the world. Although the first millennium had come and gone, anxieties about the apocalypse remained intense, and Wulfstan, like other writers of his day, interpreted the turmoil around him as signs of the approaching end times. The reign of King Edgar had already come to be viewed as the peak of Anglo-Saxon rule, a golden age of peace and order from which England had dramatically declined. Edgar's legacy, long celebrated, earned him the title Edgar the Peaceable, and he was remembered as the model of good kingship. In contrast, his son Ethelred, born around 968 and ruling until 1016, came to be seen as a symbol of failed leadership. His nickname, often interpreted as Ethelred the Unready, actually stems from unread, meaning badly advised, a play on his name, which meant noble counsel. Although the pun offers a softer interpretation, it still reflects the widespread disappointment in his reign. Ethelred's rule began with the murder of his half-brother, was interrupted by his exile, and ended with the conquest of England by the Danish king Knut. His time on the throne was marked by instability, brutal politics, and above all, his failure to stop the renewed wave of Viking attacks. These raids, which returned in the 980s after decades of peace, escalated until England was overwhelmed, earning Ethelred harsh criticism, both from his contemporaries and later historians. Yet, despite this political breakdown, the period was not without progress in other areas. The late 10th and early 11th centuries witnessed a flourishing of intellectual life in both Latin and Old English. It was also a time of increased social mobility, with many new landowners emerging and enjoying rising wealth. This growing class of local gentry, although affected by the chaos of the time, still found opportunities for prosperity and advancement. When Edgar died on the 8th of July, 975, in his early 30s, the impact was immediate and profound. A monk named Byrhtferth later described how the kingdom was shaken. Bishops were confused, nobles were angry, and the monastic communities were gripped by fear. In contrast, the secular clergy rejoiced, believing their time had come. According to Byrhtferth, influential figures like Ælfhere, the earldoman of Mercia, led opposition to the monastic communities, seizing their lands and turning public opinion against them. This wave of unrest spread east across Mercia, only halting with the intervention of ealdorman Ethelwine of East Anglia, who was praised by Byrhtferth for his leadership and noble character. Other sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Book of Bishop Ethelwold, also record how monasteries like Ely were repeatedly stripped of property in the aftermath of Edgar's death. This backlash, often referred to as the anti-monastic reaction, highlights how much the reforming monastic movement had depended on royal support, particularly Edgar's. Yet what followed Edgar's death was not simply a rejection of monastic ideals. Reformist writers like Byrhtferth used the language of religion and purity to cast their opponents in a negative light, portraying the disputes as spiritual conflicts rather than power struggles. In truth, figures like Ælfhere were not opponents of monasticism at all. He supported major monasteries such as Glastonbury and Abingdon, where he was eventually buried. His actions may have been driven more by local politics and tensions with the church at Worcester than by any ideological opposition to reform. Legal records suggest that Edgar's death created opportunities for individuals to challenge monastery landholdings, particularly at Ely. Some claims appear to have been opportunistic, while others may have stemmed from genuine disputes. One man, Ælfwold of Mardleybury, claimed that he had been forced to sell land to Bishop Ethelwold, and that he had suffered violence during the transaction, suggesting that royal authority may have been used to pressure landholders. In another case, the family of a man named Boga claimed a property at Bluntisham, citing a petition supposedly made to King Edward the Elder decades earlier. Even ealdorman Ethelwine, portrayed as a monastic ally in Beartfirth's writings, appears more complex in other accounts. The Book of Bishop Ethelwold shows him both defending Ely and also pressing claims against it. In one instance, Ely had to surrender other estates just to recover land at Hatfield that had been taken by Ethelwine. These actions suggest that rivalries between noble families, especially between the factions of Elfheire and Ethelwine, played as much a role in the political struggles as religious ideology. This period of tension, including the so-called anti-monastic reaction, was just one aspect of the wider unrest unleashed by Edgar's death. Long simmering rivalries and political tensions came to the surface, and one major point of contention was the question of royal succession. Toward the end of his reign, Edgar had emphasized the legitimacy of his marriage to Elfthryth and favored the sons from that union. But Elfthryth's elder son Edmund died young, leaving her other son, Ethelred, still a child at the time of Edgar's death. Despite this, Ethelred gained support from key figures like Elfthryth herself, Bishop Ethelwold, and ealdorman Elfheire. On the other side stood Edward, Edgar's elder son by another union, likely around 13 or 14 years old. He appeared a more capable heir due to his age, though some questioned his legitimacy. Later tales even claimed that Edward was the child of a nun seduced by Edgar. Beartfirth described Edward as harsh and feared, while Ethelred was portrayed as gentler and more likable. Ultimately, Edward was chosen as king, likely thanks to the backing of Archbishop Dunstan and ealdorman Ethelwine. Still, some concessions were made to Ethelred, who received estates once designated for royal heirs, including lands that Edgar had previously given to the monastery of Abingdon. This moment marked the beginning of a tumultuous era in English history, one where the cracks in royal authority became more visible and the forces that would reshape the kingdom gathered strength. Though remembered for its instability, this period was also a time of cultural vitality, social change, and enduring institutional development. Edward's time on the throne proved to be brief and ended in tragedy. On 18 March 979, while visiting Ethelred at Corfe, he was murdered under murky circumstances. Though Ethelred quickly succeeded him, it remains unclear whether he had any direct role in his half-brother's death. A contemporary account by Beartfirth in the Life of St. Oswald claimed that Edward was pulled from his horse by some of Ethelred's thanes and killed, after which he was buried in haste. These men may have acted in hopes of gaining favor under Ethelred's future rule, or possibly at the urging of Ethelred or his mother Elfthryth, who was later accused by several sources of involvement in the crime. Regardless of the truth, the assassination haunted Ethelred's reputation. One chronicler even described it as the worst deed committed since the English first came to Britain. Edward's remains were reinterred at Shaftesbury, where he became venerated as a saint and martyr. Ethelred later issued laws to establish Edward's feast day throughout the realm and offered generous support to Shaftesbury Abbey, including transferring lands and confirming previous gifts. Whether this reflected genuine reverence or an effort to repair his own damaged image remains uncertain. Ethelred's long reign, from 978 to 1016, has often been remembered as one of the darkest in Anglo-Saxon history. Since the 11th century, writers and historians have portrayed him as indecisive and manipulated by others. The nobility of the time are likewise accused of being self-serving and untrustworthy, prioritizing personal gain over national security. One Victorian historian summed it up bluntly: Ethelred consistently failed to do what he should have and repeatedly did what he should not. This harsh judgment stems in part from how his reign ended in foreign conquest. After years of intensifying Viking raids, Ethelred was eventually driven into exile in 1013, when Swine Forkbeard seized the throne. Though Ethelred returned briefly after Swine's death, he could not prevent Swine's son, Canute, from taking control. Chronicles from the time paint Ethelred's rule as one of betrayal, passivity, and disunity. The royal charters of this period often contain grim narratives about the loss and theft of land, with wrongdoers and traitors playing central roles. In recent years, historians have tried to re-examine Ethelred's reign with a more nuanced approach. Rather than merely rescuing his image, scholars have sought to understand how this reputation developed and what it reveals about kingship during that period. A key insight has been that the most detailed accounts of Ethelred's reign, especially those in the C, D, and E versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, were written after his death, most likely during the early years of Canute's reign. This means the narrative was shaped by hindsight, knowing how Ethelred's rule would end. The author's choices in what to include and how to connect events were likely influenced by this knowledge. Although these chronicles do not often directly criticize Ethelred, they clearly depict his reign as one of steady decline. The A version of the chronicle, which was more contemporary, presents a less dramatic account, but lacks the same level of detail and thus carries less influence. The challenges that Ethelred faced were not entirely unique to him. His reign revealed the broader strains within the Anglo-Saxon political system, problems that may have existed long before, but had now become more visible. Indeed, the period is one of the best documented in early English history, perhaps because landholders needed to secure their rights amidst ongoing turmoil. The sheer volume of written material may have amplified the sense of crisis, making Ethelred's difficulties appear more dramatic than they might otherwise have seemed. The real challenge is determining whether his reign truly represented a break from the past or simply a more fully recorded example of long-standing tensions. One case frequently cited is that of Wulfbald, whose misdeeds illustrate the limits of royal authority. In 996, Ethelred granted lands in Kent to his mother, Elfdryth, property previously held by Wulfbald, who had lost them through forfeiture. The royal charter recording the grant describes a troubling sequence of events. Wulfbald had repeatedly ignored royal commands to return goods he had stolen from his stepmother. He then seized land from a relative named Britmer and again refused orders to give it up. Eventually, the Royal Council in London declared his property forfeit and placed his life in the king's hands. Yet despite this, Wulfbald retained his lands until his death. Even afterward, Ethelred faced resistance. Wulfbald's widow violently defended one of the estates, killing a king's thorn and 15 of his men in an apparent effort to block the crown's claim. Although Ethelred often appeared powerless in the face of noble defiance, he was not unique among Anglo-Saxon rulers in this regard. Decades earlier, King Ethelstan had been forced to legislate for noble families whose power shielded them from the consequences of their crimes. While Ethelstan might seem more proactive than Ethelred, it's not certain how effective such laws really were. What makes Ethelred's situation stand out is the survival of detailed royal charters from his reign. which give vivid insight into the difficulties he encountered. Problems that in Ethelstan's time remained more abstract. Many have focused on the episodes of violence during Ethelred's rule as markers of his governance style. The blinding of Elfgar in 993, the killing of Elfhelm, and the mutilation of his sons in 1006, the executions of Sigefirth and Morcar in 1015, and perhaps most notoriously, the massacre of Danish settlers in 1002. Yet these actions did not mark a radical departure from earlier kings. Even in a supposedly well-ordered Anglo-Saxon state, governance could be brutal. King Edgar, often seen as Ethelred's opposite, once issued a decree prescribing horrifying punishments for thieves, including mutilation and abandonment to die in the wild. In contrast, the accounts of violence in Ethelred's reign often appear abrupt and contextless in the historical record, which creates an image of cruelty. However, such acts likely represented an accepted form of harsh justice during this period. In the early years of his rule, Ethelred was operating within a political structure he did not create. His ability to make changes was limited by entrenched interests and the restricted reach of royal authority. Despite the suspicion surrounding Edward's death, there was little overhaul at court. Key figures from Edgar and Edward's governments remained, including his mother Elfthryth, who played a prominent role in the early witness lists of his charters and likely acted as a regent due to Ethelred's youth. Bishop Ethelwold, an influential figure in church reform, was also central to Ethelred's early rule, receiving one of the king's earliest recorded land grants. While Elfthryth and Ethelwold may have supported Ethelred's claim to the throne, other officials who had once backed Edward were not removed from power. They may have lost influence, but their positions remained intact. This reveals the political reality Ethelred inherited. The court was dominated by powerful, long-established noble families. Ealdormen like Ethelwine and Elfheir came from ancient lineages with deep regional roots, and Byrhtnoth, the ealdorman of Essex since the mid-10th century, had marital ties to Elfheire. Edward's short reign also saw the rise of other nobles, such as Ethelweard, a member of the royal family with strong connections to the continent. Ethelred had limited means to remove such men, even if he had wanted to. With Edward gone, Ethelred was the only viable candidate for kingship, and those who had supported his predecessor had little choice but to accept him. It was not until the 980s that Ethelred began to take fuller control of government and introduce new policies. His mother disappeared from the record for a time, only reappearing in the 990s, while Elfheir and Ethelwold both died in the mid-980s. This cleared the way for a shift in power. A new coinage type, known as the Second Hand, likely emerged in this period, and Ethelred probably issued his first law code around 985. Though only fragments survive, it marked a significant step toward asserting his legislative authority. During these years, Ethelred also began reclaiming church lands and redistributing them to his secular followers. This is known from a series of charters, starting in 993, in which he returned previously seized estates to institutions like Abingdon, the Old Minster, and Rochester. In these texts, Ethelred is portrayed as having acted under the influence of poor advice in his youth. Councillors such as Ealdorman Elfric, Bishop Wulfgar, and the Thegan Ethelsege are singled out. Now older and guided by wiser figures, the king claimed to be making amends for past misjudgments. The retrospective tone of repentance in these documents may reflect a later effort to justify earlier actions. At the time, the seizures might have been driven by serious disputes between the king and certain church leaders. For instance, Ethelred had a significant conflict with Bishop Elfstan of Rochester, even launching an assault on his diocese in 986. Such disputes may have underpinned other appropriations of church land. The return of these lands often occurred only after the king's former advisors had died or been disgraced. Wulfgar passed away around 986. Æthelsiga was removed from office due to a murder, and Elfric was accused of betraying English plans to the Vikings, though he managed to remain in power. In the 990s, the royal court itself underwent a major transformation. New figures rose in prominence, such as Ealdorman Ethelweard and his son Ethelmer, as well as Elfhelm of Northumbria, his brother Wulfric Spot, and Wulfhea, Elfhelm's son. Around this time, Elfthryth also reappeared in the records. The narrative of Ethelred's youthful inexperience, later contrasted with his mature wisdom, may have served as a useful way to explain these changes in royal patronage and court politics. During the 900s and 900s, Ethelred's decisions unfolded alongside a rising tide of Viking aggression across England. In 980, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded a naval assault on Southampton. Another version added attacks on Thanet and an incursion into Cheshire by a northern fleet. These early raids, though limited in scale, were still damaging. In 981, Viking forces struck the coasts of Cornwall and Devon, destroying the monastery of St. Petroc, and in 982, they ravaged Portland. A particularly violent raid occurred at Watchet in 988, where a Thegn named Goda was killed along with many others. If this is the same battle referred to in a biography of Oswald, then despite the losses, the defenders of Devon may have emerged victorious. Whether these attacks marked a renewed Viking campaign or simply the first ones recorded in detail is uncertain. Earlier periods, like the late 8th and 9th centuries, also saw frequent but undocumented raids. Interestingly, King Edred's will from the mid-10th century set aside money for his people to protect themselves from famine or invasion, suggesting that the Viking threat never truly vanished. Many of the raids in the 980s likely came not from Scandinavia, but from Norse forces already based in Ireland, the Hebrides, and surrounding islands. At the same time, Viking fleets were active in Wales, attacking Anglesey, Dyfed, and Pembrokeshire from bases like the Isle of Man. The intensity of the Viking threat escalated sharply in 991, when a fleet of over 90 ships raided several southeastern towns before clashing with an English force at Malden in Essex. This English army was led by the elderly and respected Ealdorman Byrhtnoth. One Viking commander was Olaf Tryggvason, who would later become King of Norway. Another may have been Swine Forkbeard, son of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth. A man named Ethelric of Barking was later accused of conspiring to welcome Swine's fleet into Essex, hinting at the political tensions of the time. The battle at Malden was significant, and the Viking army was powerful. The chronicle offers little beyond the fact that Byrhtnoth died, and the English were defeated. However, a poetic account, possibly written soon after, offers more vivid detail. It describes the Vikings camped on Northey Island and the English holding the causeway. Byrhtnoth allowed the enemy to cross, reportedly out of pride, though this may have been a tactical decision. Refusing to engage would have allowed the Vikings to escape and strike elsewhere. Despite the defeat, other sources suggest the English inflicted considerable losses. One text claims the Vikings barely had enough men left to sail home. After the loss at Malden, a large sum of money, £10,000, was paid to the Viking army to secure peace. Still, the threat persisted. In 992, Ethelred summoned the entire English fleet to London, hoping to trap the invaders. However, the plan failed, allegedly due to the betrayal of Ealdorman Elfric, who allowed the Vikings to escape. In 994, Olaf and Svein returned with another fleet, attacking London and burning their way along the southern coast before moving inland. In response, Ethelred offered peace once more, along with a payment of £16,000. Olaf was baptized soon afterward, a common diplomatic move intended to create bonds and reduce future threats, and he promised never to return to England. These tribute payments became a recurring tactic. The chronicle records increasingly large sums: £24,000 in 1002, £36,000 in 1007, £48,000 in 1007, 1012, £21,000 in 1014, and a massive £72,000 in 1018, plus an additional £10,500 from Londoners. Although these figures seem inflated, other documents support their general accuracy. One treaty from 994 mentions a payment of £22,000 for peace, higher than the Chronicle's account. Later kings also raised similarly large sums. For example, Harthacnut collected over £32,000 in the 1940s to fund his fleet. These enormous payments strained the kingdom's economy. If the sums paid in 1012 and 1014 came entirely from coinage, they would have used up more than half of the existing currency. In reality, the tribute was likely paid through a mix of coins and bullion. Even so, churches were stripped of valuables, clergy sold off estates, and Ethelred had to exchange land for silver to raise the money. Although not all of the wealth left England, large numbers of Anglo-Saxon coins have been found in Scandinavian hoards, indicating a significant transfer of riches. Though often criticized for paying off his enemies, Ethelred's approach was not without precedent. Alfred the Great had also used payments to secure peace. In some cases, the tribute even came with obligations. Viking leaders agreed to defend England against other raiders, essentially acting as mercenaries. This policy was formalized during Ethelred's reign. In 1012, he introduced a permanent land tax to fund these hired forces. Moreover, earlier tribute payments were sometimes made by local leaders like Archbishop Sigeric and several ealdormen who sought peace for their own regions. Far from being seen as weakness, such payments were often accepted and even expected. One chronicle entry from 1011 criticizes not the payment itself, but the delay in offering it. Although the 994 agreement brought temporary relief, Viking raids resumed in 997. A raiding force plundered Devon, Cornwall, and parts of Wales, reaching as far as Lidford. Over the next few years, they moved along the southern coast, occupied the Isle of Wight, and attacked Kent before sailing to Normandy in 1000. Raids returned the following year, striking Sussex, Dorset, Somerset, and Devon. Between 1001 and 1007, the Viking threat intensified further, halted only briefly by a severe famine in 1005 that forced the raiders to return to Denmark. Although the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle portrays a picture of widespread devastation and limited resistance during the Viking onslaught, some individuals did attempt to fight back. Ulfsettel of East Anglia was particularly praised for his bravery in confronting Svein Forkbeard's army in 1004, even though his efforts ultimately failed. Elsewhere, however, the chronicle emphasizes incompetence, betrayal, or inaction. In 1003, Ealdorman Elfric, already known for his unreliability, pretended to be ill when facing the Viking forces that had just looted Exeter. As a result, the combined forces of Wiltshire and Hampshire were thrown into disarray. Even Ulf Tettel's efforts were undermined by the failure of the full East Anglian army to assemble in time. Despite the chronicle's dark narrative, Ethelred was not entirely passive in the face of Viking threats. In the late 900s, he arranged a treaty with Duke Richard of Normandy, with papal mediation, in which Richard agreed not to offer refuge to Ethelred's enemies. This was likely aimed at preventing Viking fleets from using Norman ports. The alliance deepened in 1002 when Ethelred married Emma, the Duke's daughter. Around the same time, Ethelred's campaign into Cumberland and against the Isle of Man may have been intended to deny Viking raiders any secure footholds near English shores. Ethelred also made efforts to reinforce England's defenses. Excavations at fortified towns like Cricklade and Christchurch show that stone walls were built or reinforced to protect against attacks. In places such as Hereford and Wareham, walls were constructed atop the town banks, suggesting a widespread defensive program likely initiated in response to renewed Viking incursions. Additionally, coin minting operations were relocated to more secure locations, referred to as emergency burrs. For instance, the mint at Witan was moved to the hill fort at Old Sarum following a Viking raid in 1003. The existing fortifications at Old Sarum were probably strengthened at this time. Likewise, the mint at Ilchester was transferred to South Cadbury, where archaeological findings reveal significant defensive upgrades. A new mint was also set up at Sisbury Ring, which operated alongside the nearby mint at Chichester rather than replacing it. One of the most infamous episodes of Ethelred's reign must be understood within the context of these growing tensions, the so-called St. Brice's Day Massacre. On the 13th of November, 1002, Ethelred ordered the killing of all Danes in England, having received intelligence that they were plotting his assassination and the overthrow of his rule. A later charter from 1004, concerning the restoration of St. Frideswide's Church in Oxford, describes the Danes as growing like weeds among good crops, and thus deserving to be uprooted. When the execution orders were carried out in Oxford, the Danes there sought refuge in St. Frideswide's. When they could not be forced out, the church was set on fire. The targets of this massacre were unlikely to have been the well-assimilated descendants of 9th-century Scandinavian settlers. Rather, Ethelred's wrath was directed at newer arrivals, particularly those who had been hired as mercenaries but whose loyalty was uncertain. One notable example was Palig, brother-in-law of Swine, who had accepted wealth and land from Ethelred but defected to the Viking side in 1001. Such betrayals may have fueled the king's drastic actions. Modern excavations have unearthed what appear to be the remains of those killed during the massacre. At St. John's College in Oxford, a mass grave containing around 35 male bodies was discovered in 2008. Most of the men were in their 20s or 30s and showed wounds to the back or skull, suggesting they were attacked while unarmed or trying to escape. Some of the bodies were burned, likely a result of the church being set on fire. Carbon dating places the deaths in the early 11th century. In 2009, another grave was found at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, where 54 decapitated male skeletons showed signs of violent execution. Isotope analysis linked many of them to Scandinavian origins, and dating confirmed a time frame between the 10th and 11th centuries. Though the massacre is often presented as an act of fear and cruelty by an increasingly paranoid ruler, it also reflects the intense frustration and desperation felt in England after years of relentless Viking raids. While the chronicle emphasizes treachery and terror, Ethelred's actions also reveal a ruler who retained considerable authority. The site of the Ridgeway Hill burial is consistent with known Anglo-Saxon execution grounds, hinting that the killings may have followed some form of legal process. The language of the St. Frideswyde's charter portrays Ethelred not as a tyrant, but as a protector of his people, acting in what he believed was the kingdom's best interest. In August 1009, a massive Viking army led by Thorkel, a seasoned commander who had once served under Swine Forkbeard, arrived on the shores of Sandwich. According to accounts from the period, this invasion marked a decisive turning point in the decline of Anglo-Saxon England, clearing the path for Swine's eventual conquest. The narrative that unfolds focuses less on military strategy and more on the failures of leadership, betrayal, and internal divisions that plagued King Ethelred's court. Key events, such as the submission of northern England or Ethelred's return from exile, are treated with surprising ambiguity. Instead, the chronicler emphasizes personal rivalries and flawed characters, casting Ealdorman Edric as the central antagonist. Hidden beneath these personal dramas, however, lies a deeper political story involving factional conflict, shifting alliances, and disputes among Ethelred's sons. Evidence from royal charters indicates that the final decade of Ethelred's rule witnessed a dramatic reshaping of his inner circle and governing structure. One major episode in this internal upheaval came in 1006, when Ealdorman Elfhelm of Northumbria was killed and his sons were blinded. This violent purge brought an end to the influence of a group of nobles who had risen to prominence during the 990s. Some figures, like Ethelweard and Wulfric Spot, had already fallen out of favor, while others, such as Ethelmer, son of Ethelweard, also vanished from records around this time. The rise of Edric's family, who had been present at court since the 990s, now reached its peak. Edric himself was appointed Ealdorman of Mercia in 1007, and by 1011 had become Ethelred's chief advisor. The eventual collapse of the regime was closely tied to the fallout from this power shift and the growing tensions between competing factions. The arrival of Thorkel's army had not come without warning. The year before saw a significant increase in military activity, with Ethelred issuing a nationwide order for shipbuilding and equipment provision. Every 310 hides were to provide a warship, and every 8 hides a helmet and coat of mail. Despite assembling what was likely the largest English fleet to date, the effort quickly fell apart. A quarrel between Breitric, Edric's brother, and Wulfnoth killed led to the seizure of ships and raids along the Sussex coast. Breitric's failed pursuit scattered the fleet, nullifying the hard work and resources of the entire kingdom. Not long after this chaos, Thorkel's forces landed at Sandwich and, after receiving payment from Kent, began pillaging along the southern coast. In 1010, the Viking army pushed into East Anglia before advancing into the Thames Valley and deep into Wessex. By this point, according to the chroniclers, English resistance had completely broken down. No leader could raise a defense, and each region acted alone, unwilling to aid its neighbors. In 1011, the chronicler grimly listed the regions overrun by the invaders and condemned the late and ineffective attempts to buy peace with truces and tribute. That same year, Canterbury fell after a betrayal from within, and Archbishop Elfha was captured. His imprisonment and the desecration of the city were seen as a symbol of how far the kingdom had fallen, especially given Canterbury's spiritual significance as the birthplace of English Christianity. In 1012, a massive tribute of £48,000 was paid to the Viking army, and Thorkel pledged loyalty to Ethelred, bringing 45 ships into the king's service. However, the violence continued. Archbishop Elfhea was eventually murdered in a drunken frenzy by his captors, who stoned him with bones and ox skulls before finishing him off with an axe. Thorkel is said to have tried to save the archbishop, offering all his wealth except his ship, but was unsuccessful. The brutality of the killing shocked even a kingdom accustomed to bloodshed, and Elfhea was soon honored as a martyr. The following year, in 1013, Swine Forkbeard returned to England. Sailing to Sandwich and then upriver to Gainsborough, he began a swift and effective campaign to seize the crown. His reasons may have included revenge for past massacres, rivalry with Thorkel, or simply the opportunity to exploit a fractured and wealthy kingdom. With Thorkel's fleet no longer in opposition, Swine had additional forces at his disposal. He secured the loyalty of Northumbria, Lindsey, the 5 boroughs, and all lands north of Watling Street. Rather than relying on shared Scandinavian heritage, Swine likely capitalized on existing political resentment, especially among the allies of the late Elfhelm. This may explain his son Knut's marriage to Elfgifu of Northampton, Elfhelm's daughter, at this time. From there, Swine attempted to take London, where Ethelred and Thorkel had taken refuge, but failed. However, he soon received the surrender of the western regions at Bath, led by the returning Ealdorman Ethelmer. With London's eventual submission, Ethelred fled to Normandy, seeking shelter with his brother-in-law, Duke Richard II. Swine's triumph was short-lived. He died suddenly on 3 February 1014. Though his army proclaimed Knut as king, the English nobles invited Ethelred back, on the condition that he would correct past injustices and pardon his critics. Ethelred reclaimed Gainsborough, forcing Knut to retreat by sea. Yet this brief restoration did little to heal the kingdom's deep divisions. In 1015, Thegn Sigefyrth and Morcar were murdered under suspicious circumstances at an assembly in Oxford, likely at the instigation of Edric. Ethelred seized their lands and captured Sigefyrth's widow. These acts may have been retaliation for the earlier surrender of their regions to Swine, and suggest that Ethelred's promises of reform had strict limits. This unrest provided an opening for Edmund, Ethelred's son by his first wife, to assert his own claim to power. He married Sigefyrth's widow and traveled north, taking control of their estates and gaining support from the 5 boroughs. Like Swine before him, Edmund seems to have drawn strength from a faction alienated by the current regime. His connection to this group may have deep roots, as his brother Ethelstan had been close to them, and Morcar may have served him as a military companion. The reasons behind Edmund's break with his father remain uncertain, but internal family dynamics likely played a role. By this time, Edmund's younger half-brother Edward, son of Ethelred and Emma of Normandy, was coming of age and had already represented his father in negotiations. Edward's claim was bolstered by his mother's high status and consecration as queen, setting up a likely rivalry with Edmund. With Ethelred's health in decline, Edmund likely felt compelled to act. Meanwhile, Anut had returned to England and launched attacks on Wessex territories. As Ethelred lay ill in Causham, Edmund and Edric raised troops to counter the invasion. But once again, betrayal followed. Edric defected to Knut's side with 40 ships, and Thorkel likely followed. On 23 April 1016, Ethelred died. Edmund continued to resist, but after a crushing defeat at Ashington, where the English nobility was decimated, he was forced to negotiate. The kingdom was divided. Edmund retained the south and Wessex, while Cnut took control of the north and Mercia. When Edmund died just months later on the 30th of November, Cnut became sole ruler of all England. The reign of Ethelred is often portrayed as a time of political breakdown, marked by betrayal, internal strife, and a steady descent into disorder that ultimately led to conquest. While this view reflects important aspects of the period, it presents only part of the picture. Despite the political turmoil, this era, spanning the reigns of Ethelred and Cnut, was also a time of remarkable cultural and intellectual achievement. Creativity flourished in many forms, including manuscript illumination, wall painting, sculpture, and poetry. Some of the most exquisite illuminated texts from the Anglo-Saxon world, like the Benedictional of St. Ethelwold and the Ramsey Psalter, belong to this time. Artistic excellence also appeared in church decoration, such as the detailed crucifixion at Romsey Abbey and the imposing image of Christ in majesty at Nether Wallop. Furthermore, many of the surviving works of Old English poetry were copied and possibly composed during this period. The famous Beowulf manuscript, as well as the collections found in the Junius manuscript, the Exeter Book, and the Vercelli Book, are all products of the late 10th or early 11th century. This burst of intellectual and artistic energy was partly driven by the Benedictine reforms, which had strengthened ties with continental learning since the 930s. One of the most prominent examples of these cross-channel exchanges was Abbo of Fleury, who spent several years at the newly established monastery of Ramsey in the 980s. During his time there, he taught students such as Beertfurth, a prolific writer whose works ranged from hagiographies to complex treatises on computus. The Reform movement also enriched monastic institutions, enabling them to support larger scholarly communities. As a result, a second generation of reformers emerged, devoted not only to preserving their intellectual traditions, but also to defending the legacies of early reform leaders like Dunstan, Oswald, and Ethelwold through biographical and theological writings. The instability of the time did not stifle learning. Instead, it often spurred it on. Scholars, monks, and their patrons sought explanations for the crises they were witnessing, turning to scripture, history, and moral philosophy in their efforts to understand and address the troubles affecting the realm. Their inquiries were shaped not just by events in England, but also by broader cultural concerns, including a rising sense of apocalyptic expectation as the year 1000 approached. While not all of Europe shared these anxieties, they clearly influenced the thinking of many Anglo-Saxon writers and theologians. Two figures in particular stand out from this period for their intellectual contributions: Archbishop Wulfstan of York and Elfric of Eynsham. Both produced large and varied bodies of work, and while Wulfstan was more publicly engaged in affairs of church and state, each man used his writings to confront the problems facing England. Elfric, educated at Bishop Ethelwold's school in Winchester, maintained strong connections with the reformist traditions of that institution, which shaped the voice of authority he adopted in his texts. He appears not to have begun his education in a monastic setting, however, since he writes of early teachers with only limited Latin skills, implying a more basic formative background before joining the church. Although Winchester played a central role in his intellectual life, Elfric began writing seriously only after being sent to Cerne Abbas in the late 900s and 80s. This move was made at the request of Ethelmer, son of the nobleman Ethelwerd. At Cerne, Elfric produced most of his works, which included Old English translations and adaptations of biblical texts, a grammar and glossary for learners of Latin, pastoral letters for priests, a compilation of saints' lives, and a series of homilies known as the Catholic homilies, which followed the liturgical calendar. In 1005, Ælfric was appointed Abbot of Eynsham, a monastery newly founded by Æthelmer following his political fall from grace. The monastery may have been intended as a place of retreat or quiet scholarship. Though the exact date of Ælfric's death remains uncertain, it likely occurred around 1010. Ælfric's two series of Catholic homilies, written between the years roughly 989 and 995, provided a comprehensive presentation of Christian teachings in the Old English language. The first series was intended to supply a full cycle of homilies aligned with the liturgical calendar, with the preacher primarily acting as a reader of prepared texts. The second series gave more freedom to the preacher, allowing for adaptation and selection of material based on the needs of the congregation. This second collection also included teachings aimed at educating the clergy, referencing matters such as celibacy and the importance of avoiding secular entanglements. These homilies appear to have been crafted for a wide and varied audience, addressing not only the clergy, but also lay people and monastic communities. Ælfric's move from the prestigious scholarly center of Winchester to Cairn Abbas marked a shift in his audience and purpose. Cairn Abbas, though not intellectually insignificant, represented a more modest religious environment, closer to smaller, under-resourced churches and local communities where pastoral care was needed but educational tools were lacking. Ælfric's writings helped supply these communities with the essential material needed to carry out their religious duties. While the Catholic homilies were primarily tools for public preaching, Ælfric may also have intended them for private reading and reflection by monks, clergy, and even educated laypeople. This is suggested by the context of his Lives of the Saints, in which Ælfric notes that his noble patrons Ethelweard and Æthelmer not only read his earlier works, but also requested a translation of the saints' lives celebrated in monastic practice. This implies a growing lay interest in the spiritual disciplines of the cloister. Other works commissioned by lay patrons include a shortened version of the Bible for Sigurweard of Asdal, and a letter on celibacy written for Sigurfirth, demonstrating Ælfric's appeal among a literate and devout aristocracy. Ælfric's concern for pastoral responsibilities extended beyond religious instruction. In the later part of his life, especially after his appointment as Abbot of Eynsham, he increasingly addressed the political and social challenges facing England. One of his homilies, centered on the prayer of Moses, drew a direct contrast between the suffering caused by disease, famine, and pagan invasions, and the former stability enjoyed during times of moral vigilance and monastic devotion. Through biblical figures like Judas Maccabeus, Ælfric urged the English to uphold their promises and resist enemies with courage and faith, suggesting divine reward for loyalty and strength. His commentary even reached into royal policy. In a text known as Vird Riteras, Ælfric supported the idea that rulers should delegate military leadership to trusted nobles, or earldomen. Given the chronicle's frequent mention of betrayal among these figures, such a view may have needed defense. Ælfric might also have offered subtle critiques of royal decisions. His reflections on the penance of the Roman Emperor Theodosius after the massacre at Thessalonica may contain a veiled commentary on the controversial killings ordered by Ethelred on St. Brice's Day. Much less is known about Wulfstan's personal life outside his ecclesiastical career. He was appointed Bishop of London in 996, became Archbishop of York in 1002, and simultaneously held the bishopric of Worcester until at least 1016, possibly longer. Though his early work consisted of homilies in Latin and Old English, Wulfstan made his most lasting impact as the author of royal law codes issued during the reigns of both Ethelred and Nut. He also wrote treatises on social structure and governance, contributing heavily to the political ideology of the time. Wulfstan's ideas about society, as conveyed through his writings and the proclamations he issued in the names of kings, have profoundly shaped how historians interpret this period. For years, these law codes were seen as evidence of England's inability to respond effectively to the Viking threat, what some critics dismissed as nothing more than pious moans. However, this interpretation imposes modern expectations on a very different era. In the context of the early medieval world, the boundary between religious teaching and legal instruction was far more fluid. For Wulfstan, religious and royal decrees formed a single moral framework designed to bring order and righteousness to society. In his vision, the law included both divine commands and royal edicts, not only because the king was considered God's chosen ruler, but also because a righteous monarch was expected to align his governance with Christian principles. This alignment was believed to promote spiritual and political harmony, strengthen the church, and secure the realm. Similarly, ceremonies like royal consecration, where a king promised to uphold justice and serve God, were seen as part of the same moral and political tradition as the issuing of laws. Both reflected public commitments that defined the nature and legitimacy of kingship. In Wulfstan's view of society, the Viking invasions were not so much the root of England's troubles as they were the outward signs of deeper internal failings. This interpretation followed a long-standing tradition, echoing earlier thinkers like Alcuin of York and King Alfred, both of whom had seen Viking attacks as divine punishment for moral decline. Wulfstan was deeply influenced by Alcuin's writings and adapted similar themes in his own work. His early sermons were shaped by the spiritual anxieties surrounding the year 1000, a time when many believed the end of the world was imminent. These texts are filled with apocalyptic warnings, urging people to prepare their hearts and minds for the tribulations that were believed to signal the coming of the Antichrist. Even after the turn of the millennium, when the immediate fears of apocalypse began to fade, Wulfstan retained his sense of urgency. He channeled this energy into a broader effort to reform Christian society, aiming not only to avert divine punishment, but to build a stronger and more orderly realm. As his writings matured, the Vikings appeared more frequently, though not as primary causes of turmoil. Instead, Wulfstan depicted them as consequences of the English people's spiritual decay, evidence of their sins, weakness, and indulgence in immoral behavior. Wulfstan's ideas shaped royal legislation in profound ways. He played a central role in drafting the laws issued in King Ethelred's name at Inham in 1008. These legal codes, now preserved in various versions and languages, were deeply moralistic and homiletic in nature. Rather than laying out detailed legal procedures, they emphasized broad principles, calling for every person to fulfill their duties in both religious and secular life. The ultimate goal was to restore justice and eliminate lawlessness, not simply to avoid Viking raids, but to ensure the spiritual and social strength needed to overcome such threats. These efforts coincided with a significant military initiative. The shipbuilding program meant to prepare for the arrival of Thorkel's army. When Thorkel did arrive in 1009, Wulfstan once again crafted legislation to address the crisis. This time, the measures included a national call to fasting, prayer, and the giving of alms. Even slaves were allowed to attend religious services during this period. These acts were not panicked responses, but deliberate continuations of earlier reforms, intensified by the growing threat. The use of fasting and penance in response to disaster had deep roots in English religious tradition, and Wulfstan's law code drew on these familiar practices. Similarly, Ethelred's own public repentance during the 990s may have been part of an official effort to invoke divine mercy against the growing Viking menace. By 1009, this spiritual campaign had expanded into a coordinated national act of atonement. Wulfstan's message may even have extended into England's currency. A rare issue of coins, known as the Agnus Dei pennies, replaced the king's portrait with the Lamb of God, possibly symbolizing peace or divine protection. The reverse showed a bird with wings outstretched, perhaps representing the Holy Spirit or peace itself. These coins were likely not used in daily commerce, but rather served as symbolic reminders of the religious and political ideals being promoted. Among Wulfstan's most famous writings is the Sermon of the Wolf to the English, likely first delivered in 1014 and surviving in 3 different versions. Although written at a time of crisis, when Ethelred had been exiled by Swine Forkbeard, the sermon contains surprisingly little mention of the Vikings. Instead, it focuses almost entirely on the moral failures of the English. Wulfstan condemns the destruction of churches, the exploitation of the poor, the denial of justice, and especially the betrayal of lords, citing the murder of King Edward and the exile of Ethelred as examples of this treachery. These sins, according to Wulfstan, had brought down divine punishment in the form of famine, disease, oppressive taxation, and widespread suffering, possibly even the Viking attacks themselves. The longest version of this sermon ends with a chilling historical warning, quoting the British writer Gildas. Gildas had written that the sins of the Britons were so great that God allowed the Anglo-Saxons to invade and destroy them entirely. For Wulfstan, this served as a stark reminder of what might happen to the English if they did not change their ways. And indeed, just 2 years later, in 1016, the English crown passed to naught following continued turmoil and military defeat. Despite the hardships, Wulfstan's ideas about Christian kingship and social order found acceptance under Knut's rule. The legal codes issued during Knut's reign, particularly those written in 1020 and shaped by Wulfstan, brought together the culmination of his moral teachings and legislative thought. These laws were the last of their kind in the Anglo-Saxon period, yet they lived on through their preservation and study after the Norman Conquest, continuing to influence the development of English legal and religious traditions. The events of 1066 have long overshadowed those of 1016 in the public memory of English history, leaving Knut's conquest largely forgotten. This is partly due to the limited availability of detailed sources. While the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle offers vivid accounts for the final years of Ethelred's reign, it provides far less information about Knut's time as king. Only a small number of charters from his reign survive, and even among these, many are believed to be forgeries. The most critical years of his rule, particularly from the late 1020s to early 1030, are especially poorly documented. Aside from the charters, only a handful of writs, law codes, and letters issued in his name remain. Although other narrative sources help to complete the picture, they bring their own complications. The most important of these is the Encomium Emmae Reginae, which is less a tribute to Queen Emma herself and more an account of Knut and his son, Harthacnut's reigns. Written by a Flemish monk in the 1040s at Emma's request, the text omits key events, including her previous marriage to Ethelred, perhaps reflecting the complex political maneuvering she had to undertake throughout her life. Yet, beyond the scarcity of records, it is the degree of continuity between Cnut's reign and that of earlier kings which explains the lack of emphasis on his conquest. Unlike the massive shifts that followed the Norman invasion, the transition from Ethelred to Edmund, and finally to Knut, appeared far less disruptive. Though changes certainly took place, especially under the influence of Archbishop Wulfstan, Knut largely styled himself as an English ruler. He consciously portrayed his kingship as a restoration of the justice and order associated with King Edgar's Golden Age. Later sources emphasized that Knut gained the crown of all England through a mutual agreement with Edmund Ironside and with the support of the English nobility. However, Knut's early actions reveal a king still unsure of his hold on power. In 1017, he divided the kingdom into 4 parts, giving East Anglia to Thorkel, Mercia to Edric, and Northumbria to Eric, a Norwegian ally who had helped secure Knut's victory. Knut retained Wessex for himself. This division likely served to secure the loyalty of powerful men who could have posed a threat, especially Edric, whose history of shifting allegiances made him a potential rallying point for opposition. By the end of the year, Edric had been executed in a purge that also claimed the lives of several other notable nobles. In addition to these internal threats, the surviving sons and grandsons of Ethelred posed a danger to Knut's rule. Eadwig, the son of Ethelred by his first wife, Elfgifu, was exiled in 1017 and soon after likely killed. Ethelred's sons by Emma, Edward, and Alfred were taken to Normandy, while Edmund Ironside's sons were sent into exile on the continent, eventually arriving in Hungary after surviving an apparent assassination attempt ordered by Knut. Also in 1017, Knut married Emma, Ethelred's widow. The chronicle simply notes that he ordered her brought to him as a wife, while the encomium offers a more flattering tale of a queen sought from abroad. This marriage helped reinforce Knut's claim to the throne and possibly prevented the Normans from supporting Emma's sons against him. The encomium presents Emma as asserting her influence by demanding that Knut promise not to place any children by another woman ahead of her own in the line of succession. Whether this account reflects her actual position at the time, or was shaped by later conflicts between her sons, it is clear that Emma wielded considerable influence during Knut's reign. Some later accounts even suggest she acted as regent during his absences from England. By 1018, Knut had grown more confident in his position. After collecting a massive tribute, he disbanded most of his army, retaining only a small fleet. That same year, a significant agreement was reached at Oxford between the English and Danes. The associated legal text, believed to have been written by Archbishop Wulfstan, reaffirmed earlier laws and connected Knut's kingship with the era of King Edgar, presenting his rule as a return to a golden age of stability and justice. This text also set the tone for later law codes issued in the early 1020s, which further reflected Wulfstan's influence. Despite the legal continuity emphasized in these texts, real changes occurred in royal governance under Cnut. One of the most noticeable shifts was the replacement of many of Ethelred's officials with Scandinavian appointees. In the first decade of Knut's rule, most of his earldomen, or earls, as they increasingly came to be called, were Scandinavian. These men, such as Eric and Ulfr, were either relatives or close allies from the conquest. Few Anglo-Saxon nobles held on to their positions during this period. One exception was Leofwine, who managed to remain in office despite the execution of his son. By the 1030s, however, there was a significant return of Anglo-Saxon nobility to positions of power. Prominent among them was Godwine, whose rise began under Knut, and whose son Harald would later become king. Leofric, the son of Leofwine, also became a leading figure, and together their families would dominate English politics in the years to come. As a result, the older aristocracy of pre-conquest England faded, replaced by a new elite whose roots lay in Knut's regime. Among the lower ranks of officials, Scandinavians also had a strong presence, although many Anglo-Saxons continued to serve as thanes and royal servants. Still, the lack of continuity from Ethelred's administration is striking. Only a few figures maintained influence across both reigns, most notably Odda of Gloucestershire and the associates of Elfgar Mew in the southwest. The continued prominence of these groups may reflect early and strategic support for Knut during his rise to power, as well as their connections to the political factions that fell from grace in Ethelred's final years. Although Knut's reign brought noticeable shifts in the composition of the English aristocracy, there is little evidence of widespread land confiscation or redistribution, especially when compared to the sweeping changes that followed the Norman Conquest. This may be due to Knut's decision to reward his followers primarily with silver and gold, particularly through the enormous tribute he collected in 1018, rather than by granting them estates. Still, in certain regions, most notably the West Midlands, there was considerable Scandinavian settlement and corresponding shifts in landholding. In one well-known document from around 1042, Bishop Leifing of Worcester addressed both English and Danish thegns, reflecting the mixed nobility of the area. While the late 11th century Hemming's Cartulary accuses Earl Håkon of seizing land from both monks and laymen, the actual scale of such actions may have been less extensive than the account suggests. Some of Knut's Scandinavian supporters became major landowners in England. One such figure, Thentoffi, held extensive estates across several counties and established or restored a church at Waltham, furnishing it with a large stone cross allegedly discovered on his land. Others, like Ork in Dorset, held more regional influence but still controlled considerable properties, some of which were later donated to monasteries. Scandinavian military presence was also felt in urban centers, with a notable naval garrison stationed at Southwark. This group seems to have played an important role in London's administration during Knut's reign. Knut's rule in England was deeply influenced by his wider interests in Scandinavia. Much of his time as king was spent securing and expanding his hold over Denmark and extending his influence into Norway. He traveled to Denmark in 1019-20, following the death of his brother Harald, likely to secure the succession, and returned in 1023, launching several campaigns during the late 1920s. He also had to maintain diplomatic relations with the Holy Roman Empire, whose territories bordered Denmark. Knut's presence in Rome in 1027, during Emperor Conrad II's coronation, may have had both religious and political purposes, as he used the opportunity to secure protections for English travelers on the continent. Knut's military ventures on the continent also opened doors for those in his service. Godwine, who later became one of the most powerful men in England, reportedly earned the king's favor through participation in one of these campaigns, likely the expedition of 1023. During Knut's absences, trusted individuals acted as regents. Thorkel likely governed during Knut's early departure to Denmark, while Godwine may have filled a similar role later on. Nonetheless, these long absences occasionally undermined domestic stability. A rebellion seems to have occurred around 1019-20, prompting Knut to exile certain nobles upon his return. Thorkel himself was briefly outlawed the following year, though he was later reconciled with the king. Among the aspects of Knut's rule that drew the most attention was his devotion to religious patronage. Contemporary sources portray him as deeply pious and especially generous to religious institutions. The Encomium Emmae Reginae describes his visit to the monastery of Saint Omer, where he is said to have wept and kissed the floor in devotion while offering lavish gifts. The new minster in Winchester received a grand cross adorned with relics, and many other churches also benefited from his generosity. However, Knut's patronage was selective. Institutions like Christ Church Canterbury and the religious houses at Winchester were favored, while the bishopric of London was notably overlooked. Knut even seized at least one of its estates, and instead granted relics and privileges to Westminster. This may reflect the loyalty shown by London and its bishop to Ethelred and Edmund, Knut's former enemies. The continued military presence at Southwark may have been part of an effort to maintain control over the capital. In a symbolic move to neutralize potential resistance, Knut had the body of Archbishop Elfhea, who had been martyred by Vikings, moved from London to Canterbury in 1023. By aligning himself with Elfhea's cult, Knut sought to remove a potential source of opposition and instead use the saint's legacy to his advantage. He also promoted the cults of other martyrs, such as Saint Edmund of East Anglia and Edward the Martyr, both of whom had been killed by earlier Viking invaders. Whether this was meant to discredit Ethelred or show continuity with his legacy remains unclear. Knut died on the 12th of November, 1035, leaving behind a contested succession between his sons Harthacnut and Harald Harefoot. Harthacnut had the support of his mother Emma and Earl Godwine, while Harald was backed by his mother Elfgifu of Northampton and Earl Leofric. A temporary agreement was made at Oxford, splitting the kingdom between the two brothers, with Harthacnut ruling the south and Harald the north. However, this decision was made without Harthacnut, who remained in Denmark to secure his authority. His prolonged absence allowed Harald to take control of all England, forcing Emma to flee to Bruges. Harthacnut did not return until Harald's death in 1040, at which point he finally assumed the English crown. One of his first acts as king was to exhume Harald's body and have it thrown into a swamp, a dramatic gesture meant to solidify his authority. The renewed wave of Viking assaults that ultimately led to Knut's takeover was seen by contemporaries not merely as military threats, but as signs of a deeper moral and social decay. For Archbishop Wulfstan, the visible collapse of traditional order went far beyond battlefield defeats. He observed a society in disarray, where the boundaries that once separated social ranks were dissolving. In his writings, he lamented how, in earlier times, people's rights and duties were defined by their rank, whether noble or commoner, lord or servant, and how each was respected according to that status. One of his texts, titled Gethinktho, outlined the criteria that once determined a man's rise through the social hierarchy. A ceorl, or freeman, could attain the status of a thejan by acquiring a certain amount of land and fulfilling specific conditions, including owning a bell house, a church, a kitchen, a gatehouse, and holding a role at the royal court. Traders could also rise in rank if they successfully financed voyages across the sea. A companion text, Northleoda Laga, emphasized that even if a man had wealth and fine arms, without land, he remained a ceorl. Wulfstan compiled these texts in response to the social fluidity of late Anglo-Saxon England. He was reacting to a time when traditional boundaries were being blurred, and those lower on the social scale were adopting the appearances and behaviors of the elite. Displays of wealth through feasting and luxurious dress became more common among the rising classes. In this period, the Old English word for powerful, rice, began to take on a new meaning, indicating not just influence, but also material wealth. Wulfstan's efforts were aimed at restoring what he viewed as a more just and orderly past, reinforcing controlled and limited paths to upward mobility. His work was both a call to legal reform and a historical reflection. While a handful of powerful families, like those of Godwin and Leofwine, rose to dominate politics during this time, a more significant development was the emergence of a landed gentry. Among the roughly 5,000 landowners recorded in the Domesday Book for the year 1066, only a small fraction held extensive estates. Most were local figures, with holdings of fewer than 40 hides, and their influence was confined to specific regions. This new class of landholders left behind not only written records, but also a clear archaeological footprint. Changes in estate structures and the creation of new types of settlements are evident during this time. In earlier centuries, estates had often been expansive and spread across broad areas, drawing resources from various terrains in what historians call the multiple estate model. However, from the 10th century onward, especially in the South and Midlands, these large estates were increasingly divided into smaller, more concentrated holdings. Some of these new estates bore the names of their owners, such as Woolstone in Berkshire, derived from Wulfric, and East Garston, named after Esgar. Alongside the fragmentation of estates came a trend toward village nucleation. Scattered homesteads were abandoned, and people moved into compact, planned settlements, marked by defined property boundaries and open field systems. One of the clearest examples of these transformations is seen in the manor of Shapwick in Somerset. Originally granted to Glastonbury Abbey in the 8th century as part of a 60-hide estate, this area was systematically divided in the late 10th century into 6 separate holdings. Each portion became a village: Woolivington, Cossington, Chilton Polden, Eddington, Catcott, and Shapwick, and was carefully arranged so that each had access to vital resources like water and pasture. Within the village of Shapwick itself, older settlements along higher ground were abandoned and replaced by a single planned village situated west of the local church. 2 open fields were established to the east and west, while northern woodland was cleared to create grazing land and meadows. Archaeological investigations in other regions show similar developments. Excavations at Rounds in Northamptonshire revealed that in the 9th and 10th centuries, settlements previously scattered along the Naney Valley slopes began to consolidate into defined village spaces. Around the mid-10th century at Furnells, a carefully measured grid of rectangular plots was laid out around an existing enclosed manor complex. These plots, arranged with striking precision, followed consistent measurements, half-acre parcels that reflected a new phase of organized land management and social structure. The reasons behind the breakdown of larger, older estate structures remain somewhat unclear. Although land sales were active in the 10th century, it is uncertain whether this trend triggered the changes or was simply a result of them. One factor may have been the church, which appears to have played a key role in reshaping land ownership and settlement patterns, as suggested by Glastonbury Abbey's involvement in the division of the Shapwick estate. Another possible cause was the political reshaping of territory after the West Saxon reconquest of Scandinavian-held lands, with areas like Furnells undergoing notable reorganizations after the mid-1920s. Whatever the precise causes, These shifts in land use and settlement would have promoted more efficient use of labor and resources, leading to greater agricultural productivity. Descriptions of estate structures from this period appear in texts such as Wulfstan's Gethingtho, which outlines the ideal features of a lord's residence, including a cluster of buildings and defensive elements. While somewhat stylized, archaeological discoveries have confirmed that many such sites did exist. At Goltho in Lincolnshire, the estate expanded significantly in the early 11th century, perhaps reflecting changes in ownership or social elevation. Similar complexes have been uncovered at Portchester and Fackham Netherton in Hampshire, as well as at Furnells in Northamptonshire. At Bishopstone in Sussex, a manor complex included a wooden tower with a cellar, possibly used for storage or safeguarding valuables, reminiscent of the bell house described by Wulfstan. Although it is uncertain whether this complex served a secular or ecclesiastical function, it was owned by the bishopric of Seltzy and located near a church built in the 9th or 10th century, suggesting it may have housed an official managing the estate on behalf of the bishop. The gatehouse or fortified entrance described in Gethingtho has been more elusive archaeologically, but some late Anglo-Saxon towers may have served this purpose. For instance, the church tower at Earl's Barton in Northamptonshire, built in the late 10th century, could have acted as a fortified entry point, as well as a religious structure. The West Tower of St. Michael's Northgate in Oxford might have had a similar dual function. In keeping with the social expectations outlined in Gethingtho, several estate sites from this period featured churches. These structures not only fulfilled spiritual roles, but also symbolized the landholder's status. After 950, a small church was constructed near the main manor at Furnells, with its cemetery serving the whole community. Notably, some graves were marked with stone covers or crosses, indicating they belonged to the estate's lords. Other comparable examples have been found at Goltho, Fackham Netherton, and Sulgrave, and the tower at Portchester may also have served such a commemorative role. Alongside these physical transformations in estates and settlements, written records from late Anglo-Saxon England reflect a growing interest in the orderly and productive management of rural properties. Some texts outlined the responsibilities and duties of different social roles, including estate managers. A work known as the Reeve appears to combine literary flair with administrative guidance, featuring rhyme and alliteration, and listing agricultural tasks with an emphasis on style rather than practicality. The influence of classical Roman authors like Cato and Columella suggests it may have been intended for educational purposes rather than as a handbook for farming. However, other documents were more clearly practical. Estate records from this period, such as those from Tydenham in Gloucestershire and Hurstbourne Priors in Hampshire, contain detailed accounts of tenant obligations and dues. One document, the Rectitudinis Singularum Personarum, likely linked to Bath Abbey, specifies the work expected from tenants, such as payments in grain, ale, and coins, as well as agricultural duties like ploughing, mowing, and supplying firewood. Tenants at Hurstbourne, for example, had to plough 3 acres, stack firewood, and carry out weekly tasks, though they were granted time off during major festivals. These records suggest that landholders were striving to standardize estate management, though local customs still held significant sway. The Rectitudines even notes that long-standing traditions should be preserved across different estates. Wulfstan emphasized that genuine social advancement should come only through land ownership and service to the crown. His writings largely ignore the alternative paths people took to climb the social ladder. Yet the idea that wealth and fine possessions alone could elevate one's status was clearly widespread, prompting Wulfstan to argue against it in texts like the Laws of the Northern People. Despite this, the archaeological and documentary evidence shows that many did indeed try to project their status through material means. One of the most visible forms of such display was clothing. After the Norman Conquest, chroniclers were struck by the richness of Anglo-Saxon dress and the extent to which wealth was expressed through costume. Silk garments are mentioned often, and a few have survived in excavations. Decorative features such as embroidered cuffs and hems, possibly sewn with gold or silver thread, appear in manuscript illustrations. English embroidery, later famed across Europe as opus Anglicanum, had already gained renown by this period. The investment in clothing was so significant that garments were treated as a form of portable wealth. For example, the will of a wealthy woman named Wulfwaru from 10th century Somerset includes a bequest of a gold headband worth 30 mancuses to her daughter and another to her servants, indicating both value and versatility. Although only the wealthiest could afford the most elaborate garments, many people of lower status sought to imitate elite fashion to assert their social aspirations. Minor nobles could appear more powerful than they were simply through their attire. One memorable case is that of the Thegn Gospatric, who was mistaken for the high-ranking Earl Tostig while traveling in Italy, largely due to the luxurious clothes he wore. Throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, clothing had always served as a visible marker of status and wealth. But in the 11th century, there is clear evidence that elite dress became increasingly elaborate and expensive. Illustrations from manuscripts show notable shifts in female fashion, with women wearing garments that featured longer sleeves, extended cuffs, and gathered or pleated fabric. Men's clothing also evolved, with members of the elite adopting long, flowing robes inspired by Byzantine styles. This trend can first be seen in the image of King Edgar in the Regularis Concordia from the late 10th century, and later manuscripts suggest that such garments became common among the royal court and high-ranking officials in the following century. Feasting was another significant way to express wealth and social standing. Not only did grand meals display abundance through their large portions, something Norman observers often remarked upon, but they also revealed sharp contrasts in the kinds of food consumed by different social groups. Archaeological findings highlight a growing divide between the diets of the wealthy and those of the common people. Among the nobility, sea creatures like whales and porpoises were considered delicacies, and herring was especially prized in western regions. Lords often asserted their rights over valuable fish caught on their estates. For instance, at Tydenham, the lord was entitled to claim every second fish from local weirs, as well as any sturgeon, porpoise, or herring that appeared. He also had to be informed if anyone sold fish on the estate. Game animals such as deer, and particularly birds caught through hawking, were central to the diet of the aristocracy, reinforcing the association between food and noble leisure pursuits like hunting. Despite the social unrest and political turbulence that defined the later 10th and 11th centuries, this period was not without its opportunities. In fact, many people experienced an improved standard of living compared to earlier generations in similar positions. While warfare and instability likely created anxieties about safety and continuity, England continued to be a prosperous realm. It remained a place where individuals could flourish and aspire to higher social standing. This period of relative prosperity would culminate dramatically in 1066, when Harald, the son of Godwine, a man who had risen to power under King Nut, ascended to the throne of England, marking both the peak of Anglo-Saxon ambition and the twilight of the Anglo-Saxon era itself. King Harthacnut's sudden death on the 8th of June, 1042, likely caused by a stroke during a wedding celebration for the families of two of his courtiers, brought an end to the direct royal line descending from Nut. This opened the path to the throne for Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor, the son of King Ethelred and Harthacnut's half-brother through their mother. Edward's accession marked the beginning of a highly unexpected kingship, and the last one to be universally regarded as legitimate. His death in January 1066 would trigger a succession crisis that culminated in the Norman Conquest. Since then, the events of 1066 have often cast a shadow over his reign. Norman writers portrayed Edward as having chosen William as his successor, a claim used to legitimize William's rule. In later years, Edward's reign was idealized as a lost golden age, and he was elevated to sainthood. It's possible that Edward himself encouraged such a reputation while in exile to strengthen his claim to the throne. He was officially declared a saint in 1161. Throughout history, views of Edward's reign have been shaped by national biases. In 19th century England, where anti-French and anti-Catholic sentiments were strong, there emerged a view that England's legitimate Anglo-Saxon governance had been tragically destroyed by foreign tyranny. Harald was hailed as a patriotic hero, and Edward was seen as a well-meaning but weak monarch caught between the ambitions of the native Godwinsons and his Norman supporters. This nationalist interpretation, often influenced by pro-German sentiment, began to lose popularity by the end of the century as Anglo-French relations improved. The historical record from this period is complex and often contradictory. Much of the narrative was written by the Norman victors and serves to legitimize William's claim, masking the weaknesses in his justification for taking the throne. These Norman accounts differ notably from other contemporary records, such as versions C, D, and E of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Each of these chronicles offers a different regional perspective. Version C, once attributed to Abingdon, is now believed to come from Mercia and be linked to Earl Leofric's circle. Version E likely originated in the south, possibly Canterbury, and reflects the viewpoint of the Godwine family, while version D, composed later in Worcester, draws from northern sources, possibly connected with Archbishop Ealdred of York. In addition to the Chronicles, another valuable source is The Life of King Edward, a biography commissioned by Queen Edith, Edward's wife. It was initially composed during his lifetime and later expanded after the Norman Conquest. The first portion of the text presents a sympathetic account of Edward's life and portrays the Godwine family in a positive light, while the second half includes ominous visions attributed to Edward, written after the deaths of Edith's brothers in 1066. The Bayeux Tapestry also offers a visual version of events. Though created for a Norman patron, its Kentish craftsmanship hints at more nuanced influences. Scandinavian sagas, though written later, provide yet another angle on how these events were remembered in Viking traditions. None of these sources are fully impartial. All carry some degree of bias or propaganda, particularly the Norman narratives. The inconsistencies and selectivity of each account make it difficult to reconstruct the exact sequence of events. What survives often reveals more about the intentions of the authors than the historical truth, resulting in varied interpretations even among modern historians. Despite the challenges, this period stands out for the volume and diversity of surviving documentation. Edward's reign is bookended by two significant works: an encomium commissioned by his mother at the beginning, and a full biography ordered by his wife at its end. Women played an unusually prominent role in shaping the written record during this era. The reign also produced around 100 royal writs in Old English and 67 charters, though only 22 of those are considered unquestionably authentic. However, all these are eclipsed by the Domesday Book, compiled in 1086 under William's direction. This monumental survey, which looks back to the close of Edward's reign, offers an unprecedented view into land ownership and administrative structures at the time of the conquest. Together with other sources, it represents a turning point in the availability of reliable historical data. In light of this wealth of information, a chronological examination helps trace the major developments. This includes Edward's 2 decades on the throne, Harald's brief rule, the decisive events of 1066, and finally, the transformative effects of Norman rule on England's governance and society. Edward was born in or before the year 1005 as the eldest son of King Ethelred and his second wife, Emma of Normandy. His early years were deeply affected by Viking attacks, and in 1016, his family fled England to escape the Danish conquest. Edward then spent over 2 decades in exile in Normandy, even after his mother married Cnut, who ruled England from 1016 to 1035. During his time in Normandy, Edward received support and recognition from his cousin, Duke Robert the Magnificent. However, the Duke's death during a pilgrimage to the Holy Land left Normandy in a state of turmoil, as his illegitimate son, William, was still a child, and his rule was not yet secure. William's position only stabilized after the Battle of Valais Dunes in 1047, and even then, it took several more years for him to fully control the duchy. At one point, Edward reportedly arrived at Southampton with a fleet of 40 ships after Cnut's death, but withdrew due to lack of support. Meanwhile, his brother Alfred attempted to enter England separately, only to be captured by Earl Godwin and killed. From Edward's perspective, the events of 1035 and 1036 were a bitter failure. Although later accounts emphasized Edward's birthright as the heir of Ethelred, his return to England in 1041 was made possible by the invitation of his half-brother, Harthacnut. Around the same time, his mother Emma commissioned a pro-Cnut narrative that also portrayed harmony among her surviving sons. When Harthacnut died in 1042, Edward stood as the only viable royal contender in England, while his rival, Svein Estrithson, was engaged in conflict with the Norwegians over control of Denmark. Upon returning, Edward was largely unknown to the English political elite. He was no longer young and had little political or military experience, nor did he possess estates or widespread support. He arrived with a small group of Norman companions and likely spoke French. There was probably widespread concern that he might seek revenge on those who had supported the Danish regime, particularly those involved in his brother Alfred's death. Edward's bid for the throne was unlikely to have excited much enthusiasm among the established Anglo-Danish nobility, which had been appointed by Cnut and included powerful figures such as Siward in the north, Leofric in the Midlands, and Godwin in Wessex. All of them had previously supported other claimants and had ignored Edward's legitimacy. Even his mother Emma had done so. Godwine, who was closely linked to the Danish royal family, had the most to lose. Thus, Edward's early reign was shaped by political compromise, accepting the support of these figures in exchange for being accepted as king. He was crowned on Easter Day in 1043 and found himself presiding over a kingdom led by a heavily Scandinavian aristocracy, very different from the political landscape his father had known. To secure Godwine's backing, Edward made significant concessions. Godwine likely gained Kent, and his sons were appointed to powerful positions. Sweyn became Earl on the Welsh border, Harald took control of East Anglia, and Bjorn, nephew of Edward's wife, was granted lands in the Midlands. Edward also married Godwine's daughter, Edith, in 1045. These promotions, particularly Sweyn's in the west, were partly meant to counter the power of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn, the king of Gwynedd. However, this move came at Leofric's expense, as his brother Edwine had recently been killed in conflict with the Welsh. These appointments shifted the balance of power in favor of the Godwine family. But tensions soon emerged. In 1047, Sweyn Godwinson abducted an abbess and fled into exile. Meanwhile, Edward refused to support Sweyn Estrithson's struggle to defend Denmark from Norwegian conquest, which led to its fall to Harald Hardrada, the feared Norwegian warlord. This was a major blow to Godwine's ambitions. The alliance further deteriorated when Sweyn Godwinson murdered his cousin Bjorn, a member of the Danish royal family. Around the same time, Godwine was reinforcing ties with Flanders, arranging a marriage between his son Tostig and Count Baldwin's sister Judith, something Edward seems to have opposed. Instead, Edward aligned himself with Emperor Henry III and even mobilized a fleet against Baldwin in 1049. Conflicts between the king and his in-laws increasingly extended into foreign policy. By the end of the 1040s, the failure of Queen Edith to produce an heir had also become a pressing issue. Each side may have begun reassessing their positions. Godwin distancing himself from his wife's Danish relatives suggests he may have been laying the groundwork for his own sons to succeed to the throne. Edward, on the other hand, might have been considering a new marriage in hopes of producing a direct heir. Meanwhile, the royal court had become increasingly populated by Edward's continental allies. He appointed Norman and Lotharingian clerics to key positions and brought in a number of foreign laymen, most notably his nephew Ralph, who was made earl in the Midlands after Beorn's death. Robert of Jumièges, a trusted Norman, was appointed Bishop of London in 1044 and then Archbishop of Canterbury in 1051, despite Godwin's objections. Edward also quietly worked to build a power base of loyal allies along the borders. Richard Fitz-Scrobb, for example, built a castle in Herefordshire, while lands along the coast were granted to Norman monasteries. Osborne Fitz-Osborne was given Bosham in Sussex. Though castles were rare in England before the Norman Conquest, all three that are known to have existed before 1066 were linked to Edward's Norman supporters. These fortifications were unpopular, but Edward tried to balance this by disbanding the royal fleet to ease the tax burden. He may have also restored Sweyn to his former position in 1052, possibly as a conciliatory gesture towards Godwine. However, relations with Godwine eventually broke down completely in 1051. Tensions seem to have peaked following Robert of Jumièges' elevation to Canterbury and his return from Rome, invigorated by contact with the newly reformed papacy. The life of King Edward blames Robert's influence for the deteriorating relationship, but the final crisis came when Count Eustace of Boulogne, Edward's brother-in-law, had a violent clash with townspeople in Dover, part of Godwin's territory. Godwin refused to punish the townsfolk, prompting a standoff. Edward was supported by other powerful earls, Leofric, Siward, and Ralph, who helped drive Godwin and his family into exile. Most fled to Flanders, while Harald and Leofwine took refuge in Ireland. Edward sent Queen Edith to a convent, a typical strategy used by kings to remove politically inconvenient wives. During Godwine's absence from September 1051 to September 1052, Edward had a rare chance to assert his own authority. His new coinage adopted a royal portrait and a scepter with the word peace inscribed on the reverse, reflecting an effort to calm tensions. Leofric was rewarded. His son Elfgar received Harold's former earldom, and Leofric's influence may have spread to Oxfordshire. Sigurd likely gained more territory as well. Edward promoted new men, including the Norman Osbern Pentecost, who was granted land in Herefordshire, and his distant relative Odda, who became Earl in the southwest. A particularly intriguing detail appears in one version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which notes that William, Duke of Normandy, visited Edward in 1051 with a large retinue and was well received. Although Norman sources don't confirm this, the visit remains a possibility. Another account by William of Jumièges suggests Edward sent Archbishop Robert to Normandy to nominate William as his heir. Robert would have passed through Normandy en route to and from Rome, making this plausible. Members of the Godwine family became hostages in Normandy, likely around this time. Edward was probably preparing for Godwin's return with Flemish support, while Harold sought aid from Ireland. With William now secure in Normandy, Edward may have seen him as a useful ally, and certainly one to whom he owed a great deal. He also seems to have been determined to block Scandinavian claimants from the throne. The French king's sudden opposition to William may also relate to these developments in England. Whether Edward explicitly promised William the crown is unclear. No English sources from the time confirm such a pledge, and ultimately, the decision on succession was not entirely Edward's to make. In the final years of his reign, Edward appeared to take a more assertive role, shaping events according to his will. However, this control was short-lived. In the summer of 1052, Godwin and his son Harald returned with combined forces, rallying support and building a fleet in Sussex and Kent. Edward's own backers were not as steadfast as before, and when both sides met in London, a peace agreement was reached. This settlement fully restored Godwine and his family to their former status. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the foreign advisors who had brought unlawful influence were exiled, except for a select few whom Edward was permitted to retain. Bishops Robert, William, and Ulf fled with the remaining Normans, barely escaping to the continent. Edward was compelled to reinstate his wife Edith and abandon any prior plans for the succession, though what those plans may have been remains unclear. The death of Swine Godwinson later that year during a pilgrimage to the Holy Land removed the most disruptive figure in the family. With Godwin and Harold reinstated, their control extended from Cornwall to Norfolk, making them the most powerful faction in England. Other prominent figures, like Earl Odda, saw their authority reduced significantly. Following the deaths of several senior nobles, Godwin in 1053, Siward in 1055, Odda in 1056, and both Leofric and Ralph in 1057, Edward had a rare opportunity to reorganize the earldoms. Instead of redistributing power more broadly, he reinforced the dominance of the Godwine family. Harold received Wessex, while his brothers were granted other key regions. Tostig was given Northumbria by 1056. Gurth received East Anglia by 1059, and Leofwine was placed in charge of the southeast Midlands by the same year. These appointments concentrated authority in the hands of the Godwinsons, who by then governed the majority of England. Edward's acquiescence to this family's growing influence is difficult to explain without assuming he felt politically isolated or unable to resist. Elfgar, a rival earl, was outlawed in 1055 and again in 1058. though he returned each time with support from Welsh and Norse allies. The earldoms themselves were the foundation of political power, encompassing judicial oversight, regional governance, and the authority to raise armies. Over time, these positions had become tied to significant landholdings, many of which had originated from royal estates granted for the purpose of sustaining local administration. These estates were usually held only while an individual remained in office, making their tenure somewhat unstable. Still, earls typically ranked among the wealthiest local figures and attracted widespread loyalty. Although the crown frequently reshuffled earldoms, there was a growing trend toward hereditary succession, as seen in Leofric's family in the northwest and the Godwines in Wessex. In practice, some regions functioned almost independently of the crown, relying on their earls and bishops rather than on the king. Cheshire, for example, had been under earl control for generations, and Edward never even visited parts of Siward and Leofric's territories. This semi-autonomous regionalism was evident in several key events, including the arrival of Elfgar's Viking allies at Chester in 1055 after a destructive raid on Hereford, and the marriage alliances pursued by both Godwine and Leofric with foreign rulers in Flanders and Gwynedd. These incidents highlight how limited Edward's influence had become in certain parts of the kingdom. By 1066, the combined wealth of the Godwinsons nearly matched that of the king himself. While the precise value of their holdings is hard to calculate, particularly in terms of privileges like the farm of one knight, which allowed powerful individuals to receive hospitality from estates, it is clear that their economic base was vast. Tostig's holdings in Northumbria during the 1050s further strengthened their position, and Queen Edith's own estates may have contributed as well. Even if Edward still retained slightly more wealth, the difference was minimal. Moreover, nobles like Harald and Tostig held lands far outside their official territories, indicating the scale of their reach. For instance, Harald controlled lands in Yorkshire despite never serving as earl there, and some of these holdings had not been returned to the crown when prior earls were removed. The issue of succession remained unresolved. Around the mid-1000s and 50s, an attempt was made to bring back Edward the Exile, the son of King Edmund Ironside, from Hungary. He arrived in 1057 with his wife and children, including young Edgar, but died shortly after reaching England. Though Edgar, then about 5 years old, was acknowledged as Etheling and placed under Queen Edith's care, he was never integrated into court life and received no formal support from Edward, even by 1066, when he was in his early teens. During this period, Edward increasingly retreated from governance. The military campaigns in Wales in 1063 were led by Harald and Tostig, not the king. These campaigns resulted in the death of King Gruffudd of Wales, likely helped by the earlier passing of Earl Elfgar, Gruffudd's father-in-law. Meanwhile, Edward focused his time on hunting and the construction of Westminster Abbey, showing little interest in political affairs. By the end of his reign, real power had passed almost entirely into the hands of the Godwinsons. The crisis that ultimately unfolded in 1066 had been building over the previous 2 years. Although the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle makes no mention of it, Norman accounts describe Harold making a journey to the continent around 1064, sailing from Bosham in Sussex. While the life of King Edward refers generally to Harold's involvement in continental affairs, it doesn't specifically mention this trip. The Bayeux Tapestry, however, uses this event as the opening act in the battle for the English throne. The purpose of Harold's voyage remains unclear. He might have been attempting to secure the release of relatives held as hostages at William of Normandy's court, suggesting a deliberate mission to meet the Duke. Another possibility is that he was trying to make contact with William's adversaries in hopes of discouraging Norman interference after Edward's death. It's also worth noting that Baldwin V of Flanders, once a strong ally of Harold's family, ruled nearby, though by this time he was tied to William by marriage. After landing, Harold was seized by the Count of Ponthieu, only to be rescued by Duke William, who then persuaded Harold to swear an oath of loyalty and accept arms as his vassal. Norman chroniclers used this episode to argue that Harold's later claim to the English throne was illegitimate, branding him a betrayer when he eventually accepted the crown. Some accounts even claimed that Harold was betrothed to one of William's daughters, though there is no agreement on which one. Had Harold triumphed at Hastings, such tales would likely have faded into obscurity. Nonetheless, these narratives suggest that negotiations between Harold and William had taken place, but failed due to both men refusing to relinquish their claim to the throne. The Bayeux Tapestry appears to show Edward confronting Harold upon his return, with Harold depicted in a submissive pose, casting doubt on the theory that he had been sent by Edward to confirm William's right to rule. More pressing for the succession was the rebellion in Northumbria during the autumn of 1065. Tostig had served as Earl for a decade, maintaining peace along the Scottish border and playing a key role in the Welsh campaign alongside Harold in 1063. He held considerable power and had close ties to both Queen Edith and King Edward. According to later accounts, Queen Edith ordered the assassination of a northern noble, Gospatric, in December 1064 on Tostig's behalf. Tostig also executed 2 other Northumbrian nobles at York. The rebels accused him of heavy taxation and abuse of justice. While Tostig was with the king in Dorset, the Northumbrians revolted, stormed York, and demanded their own choice of earl. They turned to Morcar, the younger brother of Earl Edwin of Mercia, ensuring support from both Mercia and Wales. Their forces plundered lands in the East Midlands, especially areas owned by Tostig, causing extensive destruction. Harold negotiated with the rebels and earned some praise in the Chronicle for his efforts, though the life of King Edward hints that he may have secretly supported the rebellion. While this accusation may overstate his role, it's likely Harold influenced the outcome to his own benefit, something Tostig himself believed. Edward wanted to confront the rebels militarily, but was ultimately forced to accept Morcar's appointment and permit Tostig's exile to Flanders. Around this time, Harold married Ildgith, the widowed sister of Edwin and Morcar, thereby aligning himself with the only other major English noble family. By removing Tostig and drawing Edwin and Morcar into his orbit, Harold was consolidating his position as the most powerful figure in the realm. This growing support for Harold is reflected in the tone of the sea version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was typically critical of Godwin's family, but now praised Harold's loyalty and readiness to serve the king. Meanwhile, the life of King Edward suggests that the king was deeply frustrated by his inability to act without Harold's cooperation, and this helplessness may have contributed to the illness that led to his death in early 1066. By then, Harold had clearly surpassed the king in practical authority. While some sources remain cautious, it appears that Edward did name Harold as his successor on his deathbed, or at the very least entrusted him with the care of the kingdom. Edward died in January and was buried at Westminster Abbey on the 6th. That same day, Harold was crowned in the very same church. Harold II's reign lasted less than 10 months, yet his rise to the throne marked a significant turning point in English history. Although he was not a direct male line descendant of previous English kings, He was the brother-in-law of Edward the Confessor and the most powerful earl in the kingdom, making him a natural choice in the eyes of many. It's worth remembering that Edward himself had not inherited the crown from his English father, but from his half-brother of Danish and Norman lineage, to whom Harald was also related through his mother. Harald was an experienced leader in both politics and warfare, possessed an authoritative physical presence, and had a strong family network capable of securing the succession. His claim faced little resistance, and there was no serious move to support Edgar Atheling, the only remaining heir of the old royal bloodline. With his swift coronation, Harald gained immediate legitimacy and the symbolic strength of being a consecrated king. All major earls, except Waltheof in a small eastern command, were either his kin or allies. Harald brought with him the vast resources of his former earldom, which stretched across much of southern and western England, giving the crown unprecedented territorial control and strengthening royal authority beyond what Edward had wielded in the previous decade. Harald quickly took charge of royal administration. He issued writs, though only one survives today, and began minting new silver coins featuring his image. These coins were struck across England and produced using the same engravers who had worked under Edward. The design Harald chose was distinctive. Like Edward, he was shown holding a scepter and wearing a beard, but he appeared younger and more fashionable. His portrait faced left, and he wore a crown rather than a helmet, with symbolic markings reinforcing his claim to kingship and aiming to reassure the kingdom during the uncertain transition. Meanwhile, William of Normandy also believed he was the rightful heir to Edward's throne, despite lacking royal English ancestry. He had recently consolidated his power across northwestern France, as both the French king and the Count of Anjou had died, leaving young heirs behind. Throughout the summer, Harald kept forces prepared along the southern coast of England, anticipating an invasion. However, only Tostig arrived with a minor force. He was repelled from the south, then from Lincolnshire, and ultimately fled north to Scotland. Tostig's intentions remain unclear, whether he merely sought restoration to his earldom or actively aimed to dethrone his brother. Regardless, he lacked the manpower to confront either Harald or the Mercian earls Edwin and Morcar. Back in Normandy, William launched an ambitious campaign to build a fleet capable of transporting his cavalry across the Channel, an undertaking not seen before. The Bayeux Tapestry famously depicts the scale of his preparations. William of Poitiers later chronicled these events in a style reminiscent of Caesar's military commentaries, possibly to elevate the Duke's leadership. Though he described initial doubts among the Normans, this was likely a literary device to magnify William's achievements. The Duke secured papal approval for his campaign, which helped attract support from across France, as Normandy alone could not supply enough troops. William's fleet gathered at the Dives estuary, and while there may have been a failed attempt to sail, the fleet was eventually carried by winds to Saint-Valery at the mouth of the Somme. There, they waited for favorable conditions. With provisions running low and no sign of attack, Harald disbanded his coastal army on the 8th of September. At the same time, another threat loomed from the north. Harald Hardrada of Norway, despite having a weak claim, assembled a large fleet and sailed for England, bringing a formidable military reputation. With no allies on the Channel coast, he took the northern sea route via the Orkneys. Tostig met him in Scotland and provided critical local support. Together, they launched raids along the Northumbrian coast and advanced inland via the Humber and Ouse, making landfall near Rickle on the 16th of September. Harald responded immediately. While he was still in the south, Edwin and Morcar led forces against the invaders at Fulford near York, but were defeated with significant casualties on the 20th of September. The city soon surrendered. Harald marched north at great speed, arriving in Tadcaster by the 24th of September. Hardrada and Tostig had by then retreated to Stamford Bridge. On 25th September, Harald launched a surprise attack and completely overwhelmed the Norwegian forces. Both Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and only a fraction of their army survived. Just 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors back. The victory at Stamford Bridge was one of the most decisive ever won by an English king against Viking invaders, rivaling even Ethelstan's triumph at Brunanburh in 937. It confirmed Harald's strength as king and appeared to validate his rule in the eyes of many. However, the battle left the south of England vulnerable. While Harald was still in the north, William's fleet successfully crossed the Channel under the cover of night on the 26th of September and landed unopposed on the Sussex coast, bringing the Norman threat directly to English soil. William landed first at Pevensey, where he established a fortification within the remains of an old Roman-Saxon shore fort. He soon advanced to Hastings and constructed another castle there. The Bayeux Tapestry illustrates his men setting fire to nearby homes, and they are known to have taken supplies from areas as far east as Romney. Word of the Norman landing reached Harald within days, while William was informed of the recent battle at Stamford Bridge by Robert Fitz-Wimark, a Norman who had once served at Edward's court. Without hesitation, Harald began his march south. He did not wait to gather a larger army, but instead pushed forward quickly, just as he had done in the north. On 14th October, about 10 kilometers north of Hastings, he confronted William's forces at Senlac Hill, the site where Battle Abbey would later stand. What followed was a fiercely contested clash between two armies likely equal in size. The Anglo-Saxons ultimately collapsed, and Harald, along with his brothers Gurth and Leofwine, was killed. While popular tradition claims Harald was struck in the eye by an arrow, this detail remains uncertain. Once the king fell, the defeat turned into a rout. Various explanations have been offered for William's victory. Some suggest Harald acted rashly by not waiting for reinforcements, though given the devastation of his family's lands and his recent momentum at Stamford Bridge, his urgency is understandable. Others point to the contrast between Norman warfare, blending cavalry and archers, and the English reliance on dense infantry shield walls. Yet the shield wall proved highly effective for much of the battle. There is also the view that William showed greater command on the field, but most of the surviving accounts were written by Norman supporters, which complicates any judgment. In the end, it was likely Harald's death that tipped the scales, leaving the English army leaderless and demoralized. The remnants of the defeated army retreated to London, where Archbishop Ealdred of York joined forces with Edwin and Morcar to support the claim of Edgar Atheling. Meanwhile, William advanced eastward, securing Dover and then Canterbury, which surrendered without resistance. Despite suffering from dysentery, he pressed on in November, repelling an English counterattack at Southwark and burning the surrounding area. He crossed the Thames at Wallingford and continued to ravage the countryside west of the capital. Though Edgar's supporters still commanded a sizable force, they lost the will to resist and submitted to William at Berkhamsted. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned at Westminster Abbey by Archbishop Ealdred. His claim to the throne, as defended by William of Poitiers, rested on a weak blood connection to Edward, the son of his great-aunt, making him a distant relative at best. He had no backing from any major English political group and gained power primarily through force. The scale and intensity of the year's events, both political and military, were unlike anything Western Europe had experienced since the fall of the Visigothic kingdom to Arab and Berber forces in 711. The fact that William's coronation coincided with his soldiers looting and burning parts of London reflects the harsh and uncompromising nature of his conquest. William viewed his coronation as the true beginning of his reign, which marked a departure from the customary Anglo-Saxon practice, where kings often assumed power well before their formal coronation. In this respect, Harold's swift elevation may have served as a model. The ceremony gave William a crucial sense of legitimacy, and at first he took a conciliatory approach toward the English. Those who had not opposed him at Hastings were allowed to retain their lands. Unlike Knut, who had eliminated many English nobles at the start of his rule, William spared key members of the political class. He accepted the submission of leading thegns from Mercia, including Edwin and Morcar, and oversaw a similar act of allegiance at Pevensey. Nevertheless, William imposed financial penalties for confirming land titles, leading some to incur debts that ultimately cost them their estates. Meanwhile, the lands held by the Godwinsons and their supporters were confiscated and redistributed. While a few Normans already in England, such as Robert of Rhuddlan, and some Englishmen close to Edward benefited, most of the properties went to newcomers from the continent. In March 1067, William took Edgar Atheling, Edwin, Morcar, and other prominent English leaders to Normandy. Some sources suggest they were effectively hostages. During his absence, governance was left to his half-brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux and newly made Earl of Kent, and to William Fitz-Osbern, Earl of Hereford. Both were accused of forcing English heiresses into marriages with foreign knights and of levying heavy taxes. They also oversaw a wave of castle building, especially in the Welsh borderlands, where fortresses like Uias Harold, Chepstow, Monmouth, Clifford, and Wigmore were established as the Normans expanded their control. Along the southern coast, William granted consolidated estates to loyal followers who built strongholds at Hastings, Arundel, Lewes, Bramber, and Tonbridge. Growing resentment led to sporadic uprisings. Edric the Wild stirred rebellion in the Welsh Marches, and Exeter resisted Norman authority, likely in cooperation with Harold's sons. William suppressed the Exeter revolt and built Rougemont Castle to secure the town. An attempted invasion by Harold's sons from Ireland along Devon's northern coast failed, and more castles were established, such as at Totnes, to secure newly granted Norman lands. English nobles began losing their estates, either through indebtedness, forced eviction, or dubious legal means. Some fled, like Merliswine, a prominent figure in both the East Midlands and southwest England. Edwin and Morcar also left court after Queen Matilda's coronation in May 1068, possibly angered by broken promises, including a marriage alliance. The granting of a new earldom at Shrewsbury to Roger of Montgomery, in their home region, likely added to their discontent. When a rebellion erupted in Mercia, William responded swiftly. He advanced north and built a series of castles in key cities like Warwick, Nottingham, York, Lincoln, Huntingdon, and Cambridge, suppressing the revolt before it could take hold. Robert de Comines was made Earl of Northumbria, but he was killed in Durham in early 1069, sparking a larger uprising in the north. This involved the House of Bamberg and their relative Edgar Atheling. Discontent with Norman rule, particularly under William Mallet, the Sheriff of Yorkshire, drove local thegns to revolt. They were joined by Earl Wulftheof and other nobles like Syward Barne. William's campaign north and the building of a second castle in York failed to prevent a renewed rebellion later that year, which gained the support of a Danish fleet. The rebels overran York, killing the Norman garrison and burning the city. Archbishop Ealdred died during the upheaval, ending any hope of reconciliation between the conquerors and the English. William responded with extraordinary brutality. His campaign, known as the Harrying of the North, left a deep scar. Although some modern interpretations suggest it may not have been as devastating as once believed, contemporary reports tell of refugees begging as far south as Evesham. By the time of the Domesday Survey in 1086, large areas in the North and Northwest Midlands were recorded as wasteland, devoid of value or population. William reorganized these devastated regions into vast baronies. Count Alan of Brittany was granted a large estate centered on Richmond, encompassing nearly 200 manors. Other grants included Pontefract to Ilbert de Lacy, Chester to Hugh Lupus, and a new fortress in Derbyshire known as the Castle of the Peak. This widespread revolt likely convinced William to remove all remaining English officials from positions of power. In 1070, he replaced many senior churchmen, including Archbishop Stigand, who was succeeded by Lanfranc, an Italian reformer and longtime ally of William. By the time of William's death in 1087, only one English bishop remained in office, Wulfstan of Worcester. Giso of Wells, a Lotharingian appointed by Edward, also remained. During this period, English nobles across the Midlands and North lost their lands. Despite these measures, resistance did not immediately vanish. The Danish fleet stayed in the Humber over the winter and returned in 1070. But with the north in ruins, it moved to East Anglia. There, Hereward led opposition from the marshes of Ely, though the Danes merely looted and returned home. Edwin and Morcar escaped from court in 1071, hoping to join the resistance, but arrived too late. Edwin was soon killed. Morcar allied with Hereward, but was captured and imprisoned for the rest of William's reign. By 1072, William felt secure enough to launch a campaign into Scotland. King Malcolm had married Margaret, Edgar Etheling's sister, giving him a connection to the English royal line. At Abernethy, Malcolm submitted to William and agreed to stop supporting English rebels. Edgar and Gospatric fled to Flanders, while William appointed Waltheof, a relative of Gospatric and son of the former Earl Siward, as Earl of Bamburgh. However, Waltheof later became entangled in the so-called Revolt of the Earls in 1076. Though he betrayed the plot to Lanfranc, he was still executed. William replaced him with Bishop Walcher of Durham, who later became a victim of a local blood feud and was killed in turn. Despite the crushing of internal revolts, William's position in England remained precarious well into the later years of his reign. In 1085, the Danish king Knut, son of Swine, formed a marriage alliance with Flanders and began preparations for a major invasion of England. Although the fleet never set sail, and Knut was assassinated in July 1086, just before the planned departure, the episode illustrates the continued instability of William's hold over England. Concerned by the threat, William ordered the creation of Domesday Book during a council at Gloucester in Christmas 1085. The completed records were presented to him in the summer of 1086 at an extraordinary assembly at Old Sarum. Soon after, William left England for the final time to confront his overlord, the King of France. William's ability to invade England in 1066 had been made possible in part by the temporary power vacuum in northern France. Had Edward died outside the narrow window between 1062 and 1072, William may never have been able to leave Normandy. After 1072, King Philip I of France became a constant adversary, working to weaken William's influence by backing rival claimants to the English throne like Edgar Atheling, and by forming alliances with powers such as Flanders and Denmark. His long-term strategy was clearly aimed at separating England from Norman control. William successfully defended his interests in 1087, but the campaign marked the end of his military career. At around 60 years of age and suffering from obesity, he sustained injuries while riding and was brought to Rouen, where he died on the 9th of September, 1087, at the Priory of Saint-Gervais. His burial in Caen was rushed and unpleasant. His bloated corpse burst as monks attempted to fit it into a stone coffin that was too small, cutting the funeral short. His death marked a turning point. For the first time, an English king died and was buried outside of the British Isles. William left behind 4 sons, and his succession was immediately contested. His eldest, Robert, inherited Normandy, while England was seized by his second son, William, later known as William Rufus. The youngest son, Henry, was initially given only a few castles. Edgar Atheling, although still alive, was no longer considered a serious candidate for the throne, and his association with Robert weakened his position in England. Eventually, it was Henry who would emerge as King of England after William Rufus's mysterious death in the New Forest in 1100, and later as Duke of Normandy after defeating his brother Robert in 1106. One of Henry's first political moves was to marry Edith, daughter of King Malcolm of Scotland and niece of Edgar Atheling. This marriage helped solidify his position by linking the Norman crown to the native royal bloodline. Though some Norman nobles were initially resistant to the union, Edith's decision to adopt the name Matilda helped ease tensions. By the late 11th century, England was still, by the standards of the time, a relatively well-run and cohesive state. Political unity had allowed for a system in which royal authority reached down to the local level through a network of defended towns, known as burghs, and courts that operated within each shire and its subdivisions. These were supervised by earls, bishops, and sheriffs, all essentially appointed by the king. Local management of royal estates and tax collection was handled by a class of service aristocracy, closely tied to the monarchy. The king had the ability to legislate nationally, levy taxes, raise armies, and control the coinage, with minimal circulation of foreign money. Recent scholarship has increasingly highlighted the centralized and efficient nature of late Anglo-Saxon government. When compared with the fragmented political situations in France, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, or Spain at the time, the English system appears remarkably advanced. Still, the fact that England was twice conquered by foreign armies in a short span suggests that the state's apparent strength may have been deceptive. At the very least, it confirms that England was an exceptionally valuable prize. Some historians argue that the effectiveness of central authority has been overstated, pointing to the continuing influence of powerful local aristocratic families. Any analysis of the Norman Conquest must therefore consider not only how centralized the kingdom really was, but also how vulnerable it remained to external threats and internal fragmentation. Another key question is the depth of change brought about by the conquest. While it certainly replaced the native ruling elite with a foreign aristocracy, it remains unclear how significantly it altered the lives of ordinary people, the workings of the economy, or the foundations of social life. The event undoubtedly represented a shift in regime, but whether that extended beyond the political elite is still open to interpretation. That said, the the changes introduced by the conquest were in many ways transformative. In the early 1040s, English was the language of both rulers and commoners, despite regional variations. Norse remained spoken in parts of the north, and some Welsh and Cornish speakers lived in the west. While Old Norse influenced English, contributing around 2,000 words to the modern language, it did not replace it. Edward's court may have included some French speakers, but the overall dominance of English remained. Harald's rise to power confirmed English as the primary language of political discourse, and he himself may have spoken Old Norse due to his maternal heritage. Standard Old English was used in writing by the church and monastic communities alongside Latin, and although Latin texts outnumber those in English from the period, the vernacular tradition was still strong. Many of Edward's charters, for example, were written in both languages, with English typically used for recording land boundaries. This linguistic balance began to change rapidly after the conquest. Official documents, such as the Northamptonshire tax rolls, were still written in English into the 1070s, but a shift soon followed. Norman French replaced English as the language of the ruling class, and Latin became the preferred medium for official government records. England became a society divided by language, a trilingual nation where language itself reflected and reinforced the social, political, and cultural hierarchies of the new regime. The last version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, known as the E manuscript, switched from the standardized written English of earlier centuries to local dialect after 1132. By 1154, even that had ceased, marking the chronicle's end and symbolizing the final fading of pre-conquest English literary tradition. Within just 2 generations of the Norman Conquest, the standardized written form of Old English had disappeared, and the spoken language had evolved into what would become Middle English. This transition was marked not only by the fragmentation of written English into regional dialects, but also by the integration of a vast number of French words, enriching the vocabulary and making English one of Europe's most diverse languages. A clear example of this linguistic blending is the dual terminology for animals and their meat, such as cow and beef, or sheep and mutton, which reflects an English-speaking class of producers and a French-speaking elite of consumers. Additionally, the grammatical structure of English began shifting from inflection to reliance on word order and prepositions, a change partly influenced by earlier contact with Scandinavian languages, but accelerated after the conquest. The transformation of the elite class was equally profound. By 1086, very few of those who had held large estates in 1066 still retained them. Mid-20th century scholars identified only Thorkel of Warwick and Coleswine of Lincoln as major surviving landowners from the pre-conquest era, with later research adding a few more like Edward of Salisbury and Gospatrick, son of Arnkel. While a small number of English names appear in Domesday Book, such as Alfred of Malmesbury, the overwhelming majority of landholders were of Norman or continental origin. In the Domesday records for Leicestershire, only a priest and 2 widows, Godiva and Elfeva, had English names among 44 landholders, demonstrating the near total replacement of the native elite. Though elite women had a higher survival rate, many of the next generation's nobility were born to English mothers and learned English at home. By 1100, Old English and Old Norse names had all but vanished from the upper ranks of society, replaced by Norman and French names. In some counties, a few of the 1,066 landholders still appear in the records for 1,086, but their holdings were drastically reduced and they often served as subtenants under Norman lords. Others, unnamed in 1086, may have been the heirs of former landowners, but had suffered even greater social decline. Some had likely fallen into the ranks of the manorial peasantry. Still, most of those who held land before the conquest had vanished from the record altogether. By 1086, the king personally held about 1/5 of England's land, while the church owned another quarter. Of the remainder, nearly all was in the hands of Norman and other foreign lords, leaving less than 5% with English landholders. Alongside this dramatic shift in land ownership came a fundamental reorganization of elite society. Under the Anglo-Saxons, the upper tier included the king and queen, wealthy bishops, major religious houses, and powerful earls, as well as many thanes who held extensive estates. Some, like Edric of Laxfield, possessed considerable lands and were king's thanes, directly serving the monarch. Others had pledged loyalty to different lords, but they had some freedom in choosing their allegiances. Under Norman rule, however, landholding and loyalty were far more rigidly connected. Tenure was closely tied to a clearly structured hierarchy that placed the king at the top and all other landholders beneath him in a newly centralized system. This transformation applied to both newcomers and existing landowners, whether lay or clerical. Fewer than 150 secular tenants-in-chief held large estates directly from William, and all other landholders held their property through them, with obligations of military and other forms of service. The collapse of the broader class of landholders beneath the king reshaped the structure of English society. The large Anglo-Saxon earldoms were dismantled, and new earls were appointed over individual counties rather than vast regions. Their role was largely honorary, with real administrative and judicial power passing to sheriffs, whose conduct often generated local resentment. This created a narrower and more vertical social hierarchy, in which obligations flowed upward, from subtenants to tenants-in-chief, and ultimately to the king. While Anglo-Saxon thorns had long been expected to provide military service, the repeated conflicts of William's reign institutionalized these obligations on a much broader and more demanding scale. Religious institutions also suffered, as incoming Norman lords took over land that had previously been leased to Anglo-Saxon thegns. This loss of revenue forced many monasteries to intensify efforts to reclaim property, prompting a renewed interest in pre-conquest land records. Some forged charters to bolster their claims, which also contributed to a revival of interest in English history, seen in the writings of chroniclers like Edmer and William of Malmesbury. William rewarded his followers with land in different ways. A small number received compact blocks of territory, usually in frontier regions like Sussex or the Welsh Marches, where strategic defense was essential. Others were granted all the lands once held by specific Anglo-Saxon lords, resulting in wide geographic dispersion. Most, however, received scattered and seemingly random bundles of estates across different counties. This pattern appears intentional. William avoided giving anyone noble dominance in a single area, thus preventing the rise of regional rivals. The result was a patchwork of landholdings that mixed manors from various regions under the control of individual barons. Disputes over land were common, often due to conflicting grants or outright seizures. On occasion, William granted the same land to different men, although in many cases property had been taken by force by influential newcomers, including sheriffs. One method of seizing land was through coerced marriage to a landholding heiress. Many transactions from this period remain undocumented or only partially preserved, complicating efforts to track continuity from 1066 to 1086. In some regions, the process of redistributing land by tenants-in-chief was still ongoing at the time of the Domesday Survey. While some dispossessed Englishmen managed to present their grievances in court, these cases were rare, and justice was hard to achieve. Norman officials dominated the legal system, and juries often bowed to pressure. To deter attacks on Normans, the Crown introduced the murdrum fine, a penalty imposed on communities where a dead Frenchman was found. Religious institutions were also reshaped by the conquest. William appointed numerous foreigners to high church offices, reversing Canut's earlier policy of promoting Englishmen. By the end of William's reign, most leading positions in the church were held by Normans or other foreigners, although the lower clergy and monastic communities remained largely native. One notable consequence was the redirection of English wealth to monasteries on the continent. While gifts to Norman abbeys had already begun under Edward, they became much more frequent after 1066. Newly enriched Norman lords made generous donations to their home institutions, and often looked to them for priests to serve their new estates. This trend continued well into the late 11th century. For instance, in 1094, Roger of Poitou granted the Church of Lancaster and 9 others in Lancashire to the Abbey of Sais in Normandy. The Norman Conquest brought significant transformation in the expectations placed upon the English population, particularly regarding the demands of the royal government. Unlike Edward the Confessor, who had been cautious about imposing land taxes, William implemented increasingly heavy gelds. His need for revenue was driven by the high costs of maintaining a standing military force, paying soldiers after the 1066 campaign, and later hiring mercenaries. William faced greater challenges than his predecessor, both from domestic unrest and foreign threats, so the cost of ruling was substantially higher under his regime. Although William wished to be seen as Edward's rightful successor and to govern in continuity with earlier traditions, the reality was a radical overhaul of land ownership and political power. Beneath the appearance of continuity, a foreign elite had taken control of England by force. The new regime rewrote recent history and constructed a deeply hierarchical and racially defined society in which the minority Norman ruling class viewed the English majority with disdain. The conquest was more than just a shift in power. It was deliberately marked through architecture, symbolism, and the visible display of dominance. Nowhere is this clearer than in the widespread construction of new churches and castles. Virtually every significant church in England was rebuilt in the decades after the conquest, leaving only a small number of high-status Anglo-Saxon buildings standing. There had been some precedent for this under Edward the Confessor, who had initiated the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey in the Romanesque style, likely influenced by Robert of Jumièges and the work at Jumièges' own cathedral in Normandy. But before 1066, this new architectural style was limited to Westminster. The abbey itself was preserved due to the presence of Edward's tomb, which held symbolic importance for the Norman regime. Elsewhere, however, a wave of church reconstruction swept across England. Many Anglo-Saxon cathedrals, abbeys, and local churches were replaced with larger, grander structures. At Canterbury, Lanfrance's rebuilding was not vastly larger than the Anglo-Saxon cathedral it replaced, which had burned down in 1067. Among early Norman buildings, Durham Cathedral stands as the most complete example still surviving, alongside important remains at Ely and Winchester. This architectural revolution was accompanied by a deliberate shift in religious culture. Many old churches had retained dedications to local saints or founders, preserving memories of Anglo-Saxon spirituality. From the 10th century onward, monastic reformers had begun replacing these local cults with more widely recognized saints. After the conquest, the influx of continental clergy accelerated this process. Local saints, whose stories lacked formal approval, were suppressed, and new churches were dedicated to universally acknowledged figures. The result was a widespread loss of communal memory and a sharp decline in the recognition of English saints, with only a few, like Saint Bertolin in Stafford or Saint Eadburh in Pershore, remaining in memory. Castles were another defining feature of Norman rule, serving both as symbols of authority and instruments of control. While some late Anglo-Saxon noble residences had included defensive features such as earthworks and ditches, like those at Portchester, Golthoe, and Sulgrave, they generally lacked the scale and military functionality of Norman castles. Earlier fortifications had typically served entire communities, whereas Norman castles were private strongholds, providing security for the elite alone. They were built with military architecture in mind, including ringworks, mottes, and eventually stone keeps. The first castles built by William at Pevensey and Hastings were earth and timber structures, marking the start of a campaign of castle construction that would expand across England, Wales, Scotland, and later Ireland. Newly arrived lords from Normandy. Brittany and France built fortresses as the central points of their estates. Robert of Rhuddlan did so in North Wales, for example. William used castles strategically to consolidate control over major urban centers. Around London, 3 castles were raised: the White Tower, Baynard's Castle, and Montfichet Castle. In York, 2 were constructed, and in nearly every major town, a castle was erected, often displacing local communities and demolishing existing homes. In Canterbury, a motte called Dane John was built within the city walls in 1066, followed by a stone keep at Worthgate, which led to the destruction of over 30 homes. In compensation, the abbot of St. Augustine's was granted several properties elsewhere in town. Although modern interpretations often emphasize the symbolic nature of castles in affirming noble status, during the Norman period, their role as tools of military occupation and colonization was unmistakable. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers saw them as emblems of oppression. One such chronicler, recording William's death in the E version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, noted bitterly that the king had built castles and oppressed the people. He accused William of seizing vast amounts of wealth through unjust means, draining gold and silver from the English people with little justification. This critique captures how, for many, the Norman regime was experienced not as a continuation of tradition, but as a brutal imposition of foreign rule. Castles served as one of the most powerful instruments of control for the Norman elite. Their fortified walls protected noble households and their wealth, while towers and prisons projected dominance over the local population. Many castles, such as Pillsbury, remain undocumented, making it unclear whether they were constructed immediately after the conquest or during later periods of unrest, like the Civil War of King Stephen's reign. Excavations at Hendomen in Montgomeryshire have revealed that timber castles could provide comfortable and sophisticated residences for high-status families, in this case, the Earls of Shrewsbury, who had commissioned its construction. From such findings, it becomes evident that the Norman presence had a deep and lasting impact. Yet, when the focus shifts away from the nobility, the imprint of the conquest is less immediately obvious. The widespread rebuilding of churches in stone was not entirely a Norman innovation, as the trend had already begun during the later Anglo-Saxon period, in line with similar developments elsewhere in Europe. Major figures like Earl Leofric, and his wife Godiva had already funded new religious buildings, including St. Mary's at Stowe and Coventry Abbey. Likewise, Tovey the Proud had relocated a significant religious relic to Waltham Abbey and initiated construction there. Even when the names of patrons are unknown, many parish churches, especially in areas like coastal Sussex, retain Anglo-Saxon architectural elements, with some, such as the church at Sompting, remaining largely intact. In places like Earl's Barton in Northamptonshire, a late Anglo-Saxon church stands near earthworks linked to a high-status fortified site, suggesting continuity between elite residences and places of worship. The Domesday Survey records a notable presence of churches across East Anglia by 1066, hinting that the development of manorial parishes was already underway. In the south and east, small, single-village parishes became increasingly common, while in more peripheral regions, parishes tended to remain large and sprawling. Although many of the earliest surviving stone churches date from the Norman period, the momentum behind church construction had begun before the conquest and continued to grow into the 13th century. Modern estimates now place England's population in the 11th century between 2 and 2.5 million, significantly higher than the older figures of 1.2 to 1.5 million. These newer estimates place 11th century England on par with population levels around 1500. Despite the major social upheavals of the conquest, Norman immigration was minimal, perhaps numbering no more than 20,000 people, less than 1% of the population. Far more English were killed or displaced, but the genetic and demographic makeup of the country remained overwhelmingly English. England at this time was still overwhelmingly rural. Around 90% of the population lived off the land, working in agriculture. Few Normans took up farming. Over a third of those recorded in Domesday were villeins, small-scale farmers tied to the manorial court. Other major categories included boarders, cotters, and slaves, all engaged in rural labor. These groups were not newcomers but native English. The clustering of rural settlements into villages, known as settlement nucleation, was already underway before 1066, though Norman lords may have introduced the pattern into new areas. Brittany and France built fortresses as the central points of their estates. Robert of Rhuddlan did so in North Wales, for example. William used castles strategically to consolidate control over major urban centers. Around London, 3 castles were raised: the White Tower, Baynard's Castle, and Montfichet Castle. In York, 2 were constructed, and in nearly every major town, a castle was erected, often displacing local communities and demolishing existing homes. In Canterbury, a motte called Dane John was built within the city walls in 1066, followed by a stone keep at Worthgate, which led to the destruction of over 30 homes. In compensation, the abbot of St. Augustine's was granted several properties elsewhere in town. Although modern interpretations often emphasize the symbolic nature of castles in affirming noble status, during the Norman period, their role as tools of military occupation and colonization was unmistakable. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers saw them as emblems of oppression. One such chronicler, recording William's death in the E version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, noted bitterly that the king had built castles and oppressed the people. He accused William of seizing vast amounts of wealth through unjust means, draining gold and silver from the English people with little justification. This critique captures how, for many, the Norman regime was experienced not as a continuation of tradition, but as a brutal imposition of foreign rule. Castles served as one of the most powerful instruments of control for the Norman elite. Their fortified walls protected noble households and their wealth, while towers and prisons projected dominance over the local population. Many castles, such as Pillsbury, remain undocumented, making it unclear whether they were constructed immediately after the conquest or during later periods of unrest, like the civil war of King Stephen's reign. Excavations at Hendomen in Montgomeryshire have revealed that timber castles could provide comfortable and sophisticated residences for high-status families, in this case, the Earls of Shrewsbury, who had commissioned its construction. From such findings, it becomes evident that the Norman presence had a deep and lasting impact. Yet, when the focus shifts away from the nobility, the imprint of the conquest is less immediately obvious. The widespread rebuilding of churches in stone was not entirely a Norman innovation, as the trend had already begun during the later Anglo-Saxon period, in line with similar developments elsewhere in Europe. Major figures like Earl Leofric and his wife Godiva had already funded new religious buildings, including St. Mary's at Stowe and Coventry Abbey. Likewise, Tovey the Proud had relocated a significant religious relic to Waltham Abbey and initiated construction there. Even when the names of patrons are unknown, many parish churches, especially in areas like coastal Sussex, retain Anglo-Saxon architectural elements, with some, such as the church at Sompting, remaining largely intact. In places like Earl's Barton in Northamptonshire, a late Anglo-Saxon church stands near earthworks linked to a high-status fortified site, suggesting continuity between elite residences and places of worship. The Domesday survey records a notable presence of churches across East Anglia by 1066, hinting that the development of manorial parishes was already underway. In the south and east, small, single-village parishes became increasingly common, while in more peripheral regions, parishes tended to remain large and sprawling. Although many of the earliest surviving stone churches date from the Norman period, the momentum behind church construction had begun before the conquest and continued to grow into the 13th century. Modern estimates now place England's population in the 11th century between 2 and 2.5 million, significantly higher than the older figures of 1.2 to 1.5 million. These newer estimates place 11th century England on par with population levels around 1500. Despite the major social upheavals of the conquest, Norman immigration was minimal, perhaps numbering no more than 20,000 people, less than 1% of the population. Far more English were killed or displaced, but the genetic and demographic makeup of the country remained overwhelmingly English. England at this time was still overwhelmingly rural. Around 90% of the population lived off the land, working in agriculture. Few Normans took up farming. Over a third of those recorded in Domesday were villeins, small-scale farmers tied to the manorial court. Other major categories included boarders, cotters, and slaves, all engaged in rural labor. These groups were not newcomers but native English. The clustering of rural settlements into villages, known as settlement nucleation, was already underway before 1066, though Norman lords may have introduced the pattern into new areas. In most regions, the rural landscape changed little beyond higher demands for labor, rent, and produce, and the construction of castles that occasionally disrupted village life. Farming methods also showed remarkable continuity. Domesday assumes widespread use of the heavy plough across Anglo-Saxon England, with each capable of working around 120 acres annually. While the data in Domesday makes it difficult to measure total arable land precisely, more than 70,000 plough teams were recorded in 28 counties. This suggests an area under cultivation comparable to the 3.1 million hectares recorded in 1914, though the geographical distribution would have been quite different. Northern regions suffered most from wartime devastation, especially after the harsh reprisals of the harrying of the north in 1069 to 70. Parts of northern and northwestern Mercia also experienced decline, but elsewhere, arable farming likely continued to expand into pasture, woodland, and heath regardless of political turmoil. While most people lived off what they grew, the economy was becoming increasingly monetized, and some surplus produce was brought to market. These markets were mostly in towns. In Domesday, York, for example, there was a dedicated meat market, and larger towns often hosted multiple specialized markets. It is harder to track local markets in this period, since the widespread issuing of borough charters that makes them easier to identify only began in the 12th century. However, place names containing the element port, as in Stockport or Bridport, often point to early market activity, and names like Hugh of the Port in Domesday Dartford suggest similar implications. In some towns, archaeology shows that the medieval layout may predate 1066. At Barton-on-Humber, for instance, Domesday records a market and ferry, indicating early commercial activity. One sign of a functioning town was the presence of burgesses, tenants holding urban plots of land under burgage tenure. Domesday lists over 100 locations with burgesses, although in some places, such as Penwortham in Lancashire, only a handful are mentioned. Certain counties show clusters of small towns, including Wiltshire, e.g. Calne, Malmesbury, Somerset, e.g. Bruton, Frome, and the southeast coastal regions, e.g. Fordwich, Hythe. Some market towns were likely already in operation even if not officially recognized until later. King's Lynn, for instance, though not formally founded until 1090, may have had a functioning market earlier. New towns were created between 1066 and 1086, such as at Rye in East Sussex, where the abbot of Fécamp established a settlement and port. Towns along the southern coast received a boost from the new cross-channel connections, while those that had relied on Scandinavian trade saw a downturn. In many regions, the largest towns were typically the Shire boroughs, which served as administrative hubs, housed important defensive structures, and concentrated minting activity. However, some non-Shire towns, like Thetford in Norfolk, were also significant. In 1066, Thetford had a long-established mint and nearly 1,000 burgesses, indicating a sizable population. A few towns mentioned in Domesday were clearly exceptional in scale. York, for instance, had over 1,400 houses in 1066, not including those held by the archbishop, likely supporting a population of around 8,000. Lincoln, Norwich, and Oxford were also major urban centers, though all experienced a decline in population by 1086, with York's reduction being particularly steep. London was undoubtedly the largest town in late Anglo-Saxon England, but because it was not included in Domesday Book, its size is hard to gauge. Archaeological evidence from within the old Roman walls and from Southwark, south of the river, shows continued development, particularly along Borough High Street. Southwark was burned by the Normans in 1066, yet the riverfront between London Bridge and Billingsgate was frequently rebuilt and yielded imported pottery from the mid-11th century onward, pointing to a lively community engaged in trade with both the continent and coastal regions of England, exporting items like wool, cloth, and lead. During Edward the Confessor's reign, all English mints relied on dies issued from London, which was the most prolific minting center. Edward's promotion of Westminster reflects the capital's expanding suburban footprint. and in the Norman period, the establishment of several new religious houses around the city followed. Whether London suffered significantly during the Norman Conquest is unclear. Some literary sources describe burning and destruction, but the removal of sections of the riverside wall later in the century implies urban growth, suggesting any downturn was short-lived. Most other towns, including many shire centers, were considerably smaller. Several even saw their populations decline during William's rule. Stafford, for example, had only 179 houses in 1086, of which 41 were vacant or in disrepair, an apparent population drop of over 20% since 1066. There was evidence of castle building in Stafford, though its castle was eventually relocated away from the town. Many houses were tied to rural estates. Some, like those connected to Robert of Stafford's manor at Bradley, likely served as accommodations for his household and retainers. These small towns experienced significant population fluctuations, with numbers rising during local court sessions, fairs, or markets, and then falling again. Even in more established boroughs, farming remained a common occupation. In Derby, 41 of the burgesses managed 8 ploughlands in 1086. The town's total number of burgesses had fallen from 243 in 1066 to 140, meaning nearly 30% were engaged in agriculture. Derby also had 10 mills, showing its role as a center for flour production. At Colchester in Essex, the Domesday Book includes a detailed list of royal burgesses, many of whom held small plots of land and combined trades with subsistence farming. In Bury St. Edmunds, records mention a wide variety of occupations: bakers, brewers, tailors, washerwomen, shoemakers, robe makers, cooks, porters, and bursars. Southern towns often featured tile-roofed buildings and were close to ceramic production centers, such as those near Canterbury. Other towns specialized in processing local products like salt, as seen at Droitwich in Worcestershire and Middlewich in Cheshire. Literacy among some townspeople is evident, and written documents were becoming increasingly important in business, estate management, and governance. Despite declining populations, many towns paid higher taxes in 1086 than they had in 1066. Hartford, for example, saw its payments rise from £7 10 shillings to £20. This pattern of lower population combined with higher taxation suggests declining prosperity for many towns. A similar pattern is observable in rural areas, where land values often rose between 1066 and 1086, despite no clear increase in productivity or assets. These figures likely reflect increased revenues collected by landlords, meaning that landowners were taking a larger share of the agricultural output than before. Consider the 36 estates of Count Allen in Norfolk, for which both 1066 and 1086 values are available. The total value increased by about 40%, from £96 17 shillings to £133 19 shillings. 16 of these estates saw their value rise, while only 5 declined. Some estates experienced dramatic increases, such as Costessey, which jumped from £20 to £45, and Ingham, which rose from £2 to £9. In Warwickshire, where there is no record of military conflict between 1066 and 1086, values also rose significantly. Among the estates held from the king by Earl Roger, Earl Aubrey, and the Count of Meulan, 68 show an average increase of about 30%. There was variation, however. Roger's lands rose by 14%, Aubrey's by 77%. due in part to temporary royal management, and the Count of Moulins by around the average. These gains suggest that landlords were maximizing their returns from farming, particularly when they had only short-term control of estates, something akin to modern asset stripping. When we examine the holdings of Thorkel of Warwick, one of the few English landowners to retain substantial land, we see similar patterns of rising values. However, Thorkel's estates were generally less valuable than those of Norman newcomers. His manors averaged just 34 shillings in value, compared to 72 shillings for Roger, 65 for Aubrey, and 67 for the Count of Moulins. Many of Thorkel's tenants were new arrivals, and much of his more lucrative land had been sublet to members of the Norman aristocracy. Even if he had wanted to protect his former tenants, it is clear he lacked the power to do so. There were many elements of continuity that stood alongside the dramatic upheavals brought about by the Norman Conquest, and these should not be overlooked in any evaluation of the period's political developments. The further down the social ladder one looks, the less likely the impact was personal, and the more it was financial, yet many previously prosperous families fell into poverty. Still, at every level of society, the conquest marked a decisive turning point. By the 12th century, even among the peasantry, traditional Anglo-Saxon names had largely given way to Norman ones. Boys were now named William, Henry, or Robert, and girls were called Matilda, Emma, or Eleanor. However, this cultural shift happened more slowly in some northern regions, where Scandinavian names remained in use for longer. The overwhelming success of William's conquest ensured that the history of 1066 was written from the victor's perspective. Norman accounts shaped the narrative of the period, and by the time of Domesday Book, Harold's brief reign had effectively been erased. William positioned himself as Edward's legitimate heir, and within a generation, Harald was remembered mainly as a usurper and a symbol of disorder. Writing in 1127, the Anglo-Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis described the events of 1066 as a period of chaos, blaming Harald, whom he called a perjurer and a man of no royal blood, for taking the throne through deceit. Had the outcome at Hastings been different, such accusations might just as easily have been directed at William. Despite tensions and opposition, William always had some measure of English support. Although the Northern Uprising was the most serious challenge to his authority, it lacked support in the south. Certain ecclesiastics who had been appointed during Edward's reign remained loyal throughout, including Bishop Giso of Wells, Bishop William of London, Abbot Baldwin of Bury St. Edmunds, and English figures like Bishop Wulfstan and Archbishop Ealdred. Many thanes also stood with William, and some served him even during his later campaigns in Normandy. Notably, during a skirmish in 1078, when William was unhorsed by his rebellious son, Robert, it was an English thegn named Toki, son of Wigot, who defended him at the cost of his life. The rebellions that William did face were often disorganized and lacked strong leadership. His decisive victory at Hastings helped cultivate an image of invincibility that discouraged further resistance. It has been suggested that his military success owed much to the combination of heavy cavalry and archers, which contrasted with the more traditional tactics of English armies. The Norman expansion into England, like their simultaneous advances into southern Europe, was closely tied to these military innovations and to the widespread use of castles. William's energy, strategic skill, and sense of purpose were central to his success, though similar things might have been said of Harald, or Harald Hardrada, had events unfolded differently. By 1086, most Norman landholders identified themselves by places of origin on the continent, such as Berengar de Tosny or Hugh de Grandmesnil. However, A few were beginning to use English place names, like Robert de Romney or Roger de Westerham. Over time, the Norman elite in England came to be viewed as distinct from both their continental relatives and from native English families. By the start of the 12th century, England had changed in almost every way. New rulers, new architecture, different cultural norms, and a transformed approach to warfare. From this point forward, English royal policy would be shaped by overseas entanglements, a legacy that would not fully end until Queen Mary's loss of Calais in 1558. Even then, the incorporation of Wales complicates the idea of a fully English state. The Anglo-Saxon system of governance, meanwhile, belonged to a world that was already vanishing. Knut's empire, which stretched along the Atlantic coast, had begun to fall apart even before his death due to internal rivalries and the difficulties of maintaining cohesion. Edward the Confessor ruled during a time of constant threat from Viking and Anglo-Scandinavian warlords. His sympathies leaned toward Normandy, and although it's unclear if he fully backed William as successor, it was the Norman candidate who ultimately took power. Anglo-Saxon England may not have ended entirely at Hastings, but it underwent radical transformation in the years that followed. William ruthlessly suppressed northern resistance, confiscated the lands of his enemies, and gradually distanced himself from English advisors in favor of French-speaking newcomers. The native elite was largely destroyed, exiled, or killed. Many fled abroad, to Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia, or even the continent, where they joined Viking armies or sought new roles. By 1088, a combined English-Danish fleet had reached the eastern Mediterranean, and many of these exiles entered the service of the Byzantine emperor as members of the Varangian Guard, fighting against Normans in Sicily. In the wider region of Atlantic Europe, the Viking era was drawing to a close, and Scandinavian influence in England had rapidly diminished. In the closing decades of the 11th century, the newly established Norman aristocracy began extending their reach into Wales and setting their sights on Scotland and Ireland. The Norman Conquest was, in essence, the most aggressive land seizure in English history. Its legacy marks a clear endpoint for the study of Anglo-Saxon England. Yet despite the trauma, much of the Anglo-Saxon world persisted. Though Anglo-Norman French and Latin became the languages of the court, administration, and high culture, English remained the everyday language of most people. By the end of the 14th century, English had re-emerged as the dominant written vernacular, overtaking Anglo-Norman. Today, English, in its many forms and dialects, is a global language and the primary language of the Internet. The Kingdom of England, central to the modern United Kingdom, was built during the 10th and 11th centuries by Anglo-Saxon rulers. Although many governmental structures of the late Anglo-Saxon state did not survive long after the conquest, England's foundational frameworks owe much to that earlier era. Its counties and shires, its parish and diocesan systems, its major towns, and many coastal ports all have their roots in Anglo-Saxon development. The rural landscape shaped during the Middle and Late Saxon periods remained largely unchanged for centuries, only yielding with the enclosure acts of the modern age. It is not just the institutions or landscape that endured. The idea of the Anglo-Saxons themselves also lived on. Throughout history, in periods like the Reformation or the American Revolution, the Anglo-Saxon legacy has been invoked as a symbol of freedom or reform. During the height of the British Empire in the 19th century, many believed that the nation's success was rooted in its Anglo-Saxon heritage. This cultural pride even led to the revival of Anglo-Saxon names such as Alfred, Edgar, Ethel, and Edwina. Well into the 20th century, English-speaking peoples considered themselves part of a larger Germanic cultural sphere. Although the world wars weakened this sense of unity, the belief in Germanic origins continues to hold influence. Historical roots are rarely simple. What one generation considers foundational, the next may reject. But the Anglo-Saxons remain relevant. Their legacy still shapes modern England and resonates throughout the English-speaking world. Their decisions, beliefs, and cultural patterns left an imprint that continues to affect the present day. We walk through a world still shaped by their hands.